Hey there, welcome to Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 3 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now, settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The evening of September 2nd, 2015, settled over Dallas with the familiar, thick warmth of a late Texas summer. For Dr. Kendra Hatcher, the day had been a satisfying blur of small victories. As a pediatric dentist, her life was a constellation of bright, gapped smiles and the quiet pride of easing a child's fear. At 35, she had crafted a life that felt rich and purposeful. Raised in Illinois with a foundation of strong Christian values, her compassion was not just a professional trait, but the very essence of her character. She had traveled on mission trips to build churches and led Bible studies for underprivileged children. Her path had led her through DePauw University, the University of Kentucky College of Dentistry, and finally to a coveted position at Smile Zone in Dallas, where she provided high-end dental care to children from disadvantaged backgrounds. Her world had recently become even brighter. A few months prior, she had met Dr. Ricardo Ricky Paniagua, a dermatologist, through an online dating app. What started with digital messages quickly blossomed into a profound connection. Ricky, who had moved to Dallas to complete his residency after a divorce, found in Kendra a warmth and sincerity that felt like coming home. Their relationship progressed with a swiftness that surprised them both, filled with easy laughter and the quiet certainty of a shared future. They were already talking about marriage. A trip to Cancun was booked, a long weekend to celebrate their love, set to begin the very next day. As Kendra guided her car into the Gables Park 17 garage, a multi-level concrete structure attached to her upscale apartment building, her mind was likely on last-minute packing and the feel of sand between her toes. She navigated the familiar turns, ascending to her designated spot. The air in the garage was still and heavy, scented with concrete and exhaust fumes. It was a liminal space, a pause between the bustling world outside and the sanctuary of home. She pulled into her spot, the engine died, and in that sudden silence, her future, so vividly imagined only moments before, was extinguished. A dark figure emerged from the shadows. A flash, a deafening roar, and a single fatal gunshot. Kendra Hatcher, a woman of deep faith and boundless kindness, was dead before her head hit the steering wheel. The initial report would suggest a robbery gone horrifically wrong, a tragic but not altogether unfamiliar story in a large city. But the truth was infinitely more sinister, born not of random violence, but of a calculated and venomous obsession. The architect of this darkness was a woman Kendra had never met, Brenda Berenice Delgado Reinaga. Brenda's story, like Kendra's, was one of ambition. Born in Mexico on June 18, 1982, she was brought to Dallas as an infant by her father, Luis, who sought a better life for his wife and 5 children. Brenda, the only daughter, grew up with the pressure and promise of the American dream. She was described as driven, always wanting to make something of herself. After graduating from high school, she became a dental assistant, later taking on a second job whitening teeth at a day spa to supplement her income. She was, by many accounts, working tirelessly to achieve her goals. Her life took a decisive turn when she met Ricky Paniagua on a dating app. He was a resident at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, a handsome, successful doctor on a promising career path. For nearly 3 years, they were a couple. In Brenda's mind, this was the life she had been working toward. But the relationship was not as stable as she portrayed it. They broke up in the summer of 2014, only to reconcile briefly from November 2014 until February 2015, when Ricky ended it for good. For Ricky, The breakup was a definitive end, but for Brenda, it was merely an obstacle to overcome. She could not, or would not, accept that the future she had envisioned with him was gone. Though Ricky considered them friends who texted occasionally, Brenda clung to the belief that they would reconcile. She maintained a key to his apartment and, unbeknownst to him, had access to his email and iCloud passwords. His digital life became her secret obsession. She was a ghost in his machine, a silent, unseen spectator to his every move. In the spring of 2015, her surveillance revealed a new threat, Kendra Hatcher. As Ricky's relationship with Kendra grew serious, Brenda's obsession curdled into a cold, methodical rage. From the secret vantage point of his accounts, she watched their love story unfold. She took screenshots of their text messages, their dinner plans, their airline reservations for the Cancun trip. Each picture of them smiling, each loving exchange, was a fresh wound. Kendra was living the life Brenda believed was rightfully hers. She was a rival who had to be eliminated. The word love triangle would be used to describe the situation. That term was a misnomer. A triangle implies all parties are aware of each other. Kendra Hatcher had no idea who Brenda Delgado was. She was in love, planning a vacation, building a future, completely oblivious to the woman who was poring over her life with forensic intensity, plotting her demise. Brenda's desire for revenge began to solidify into a tangible plan. She was a dental hygienist student at the time, but this dark project became her new curriculum. She dropped out of her program at Sanford Brown University to dedicate herself fully to the task of destroying Kendra Hatcher. She knew she couldn't do it alone. She needed accomplices, people she could manipulate and control. Her first recruit was Crystal Cortez, a young single mother. Brenda began to cultivate a friendship with Cortez, taking her out to dinner, presenting herself as a mentor and confidant. She slowly introduced the idea, framing it as a problem she needed help solving. She told Cortez about her wealthy ex-boyfriend and the new woman who stood in the way of her happiness. Soon, the vague discussions sharpened into a concrete offer. $500 to serve as the getaway driver in a plan to get rid of Kendra Hatcher. For Cortez, who was struggling financially, it was a tempting offer from a woman who seemed confident and connected. But they needed a third person, someone to pull the trigger. Through her network, Brenda found Christopher Love, a small-time drug dealer with a criminal record. To him, she presented a different facade. She wasn't just a scorned lover. She was a woman with powerful connections. She dangled the promise of not just a one-time payment, but a steady supply of drugs and a path to advance in the drug trade through her supposed ties to a cartel. Love, perhaps seeing a chance to move up in the criminal world, agreed. The price for Kendra Hatcher's life was settled. $500 for the driver and around $3,000 in cash and narcotics for the killer. With her team in place, Brenda's stalking intensified. She and Cortez began to track Kendra's movements in person. A pair of binoculars that the two women used to spy on Kendra at her dental office, watching from a distance, learning her routine. Every day, they gathered more information, waiting for the right moment to strike. The breaking point seems to have come on August 3rd, 2015, when Ricky informed Brenda via email that he would be removing her from his phone plan. A final, practical severing of their last official tie. For Brenda, this administrative detail was a declaration of war. The plan went into active execution. The day chosen was September 2nd, the eve of Kendra and Ricky's departure for Cancun. The symbolism was deliberate and cruel. Brenda wanted to destroy not just Kendra, but the happiness she represented. That day, Brenda took meticulous steps to manufacture an alibi. She had Cortez drop her off at a library, a place of quiet study, the perfect backdrop for a woman with nothing to hide. She had also borrowed a distinctive black Jeep Cherokee from a friend, which would serve as the getaway vehicle. The initial plan was to ambush Kendra as she left her office, but they missed their opportunity due to a change in her schedule. Unfazed, they moved to their backup location, the parking garage of her apartment building. They followed her there, Cortez at the wheel of the Jeep, Love in the passenger seat, armed and waiting. Cortez tailed another vehicle through the security gate to gain access to the garage. They found a place to wait in the shadows. When Kendra Hatcher pulled into her spot, the trap was sprung. Christopher Love exited the Jeep, his face obscured. He approached her car, shot her once in the head, and grabbed some of her belongings to create the illusion of a robbery. Then he got back into the Jeep, and Crystal Cortez sped them away from the scene, leaving Kendra to be found by a neighbor minutes later. In the immediate aftermath, the Dallas Police Department treated the case as a robbery homicide. But the execution-style nature of the killing and the fact that valuables were left behind quickly raised suspicions. This was not a simple crime of opportunity. This was personal. The first major breakthrough came from the getaway car. Surveillance footage from the garage captured the black Jeep Cherokee. Police released images of the vehicle to the public, and soon, a man named Jose Luis Ortiz came forward. He told investigators that he had lent his Jeep to his friend, Brenda Delgado, on the day of the murder. Suddenly, Brenda Delgado, the supposedly peripheral ex-girlfriend, was a person of interest. Detectives brought her in for questioning. The video of her interrogation would later be shown to a jury, a chilling portrait of composure and deceit. She was calm, cooperative, and expressed surprise and sadness at the news of Kendra's death. When asked about her whereabouts on the night of the murder, she confidently presented a restaurant receipt, claiming she had been eating and studying, providing a seemingly solid alibi. She denied any and all involvement, convincing the detectives, at least for the moment, that they were on the wrong track. She was briefly arrested on an unrelated outstanding parking violation, but she paid the fine and was released. While Brenda walked free, the investigation was rapidly closing in on her accomplices. Investigators located the murder weapon and traced it back to Christopher Love, who was arrested. Soon after, they brought in Crystal Cortez. Her story began to crumble under questioning. Initially, she gave conflicting accounts, but eventually, faced with the evidence against her, she confessed. She told detectives everything. She detailed how Brenda Delgado, driven by a toxic jealousy, had orchestrated the entire plot. She described the stalking, the promises of payment, and the cold-blooded planning. She admitted to being the getaway driver and named Christopher Love as the shooter. Cortez's confession was the linchpin. It provided a clear motive and a detailed narrative that connected all the pieces. But even with this detailed confession, the case against Brenda was circumstantial. She hadn't been at the crime scene. There was no physical evidence directly tying her to the garage. The case rested heavily on the testimony of a confessed accomplice. As it became clear to Brenda that her web of lies was unraveling and that Cortez had turned against her, she made a desperate move. She fled. Knowing an arrest warrant was imminent, she crossed the border into Mexico, becoming a fugitive. The manhunt for Brenda Delgado went national, and then international. The Dallas Police Department, working with the FBI, launched an extensive search. In April 2016, 7 months after the murder, the FBI took the significant step of adding Brenda Delgado to its 10 most wanted fugitives list. A $100,000 reward was offered for information leading to her capture. She was only the 9th woman to be placed on the notorious list since its inception in 1950. Thomas M. Class, Sr., the special agent in charge of the FBI's Dallas office, made it clear that despite her not pulling the trigger, she was the one responsible. Brenda Delgado was able to effectively manipulate everyone she involved in her calculated scheme, he stated. Although she didn't pull the trigger herself, she is still responsible for the murder. The pressure worked. Just 2 days after her face was broadcast across the world as one of America's most wanted criminals, Brenda Delgado was captured. On April 8, 2016, acting on a tip, agents from the Mexican Attorney General's office found her at a house in Torreon, Coahuila. She was arrested without incident. The international fugitive who had masterminded a brutal murder was finally in custody. However, her capture in Mexico introduced a critical complication for the prosecution. Under its laws, Mexico will not extradite a fugitive to a country where they could face the death penalty. In order to bring Brenda Delgado back to Texas to stand trial, the Dallas County District Attorney's Office had to make a difficult choice: agree to waive the death penalty. They agreed, and in October 2016, Brenda was extradited to the United States to face a charge of capital murder, with the maximum possible sentence being life in prison without the possibility of parole. The legal process unfolded over the next few years. Christopher Love, the triggerman, was tried first. In October 2018, with Crystal Cortez testifying against him, he was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. He currently resides on death row in Texas. Crystal Cortez, in exchange for her crucial testimony against both Love and Delgado, pleaded guilty to murder and received a sentence of 35 years in prison. Finally, in June 2019, it was Brenda Delgado's turn to face a jury. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Kevin Brooks, laid out the story of her all-consuming obsession. They presented the evidence of her stalking, the access to Ricky's accounts, the tracking app, the binoculars used for surveillance. They called Ricky Paniagua to the stand, who recounted the timeline of their relationship and his whirlwind romance with Kendra. The star witness, however, was Crystal Cortez. She gave the jury a chilling, first-hand account of Brenda's manipulation. She wanted to get rid of Kendra Hatcher because she was envious of her, Cortez testified, her voice steady. She described how Brenda had coached her on what to do and how to act, how she had masterminded every detail of the crime, from borrowing the car to establishing her own alibi. Brenda's defense attorneys argued that the prosecution's case was built on emotion rather than evidence, pointing to the use of gruesome autopsy photos and the testimony of an unreliable accomplice who was testifying to save herself. They claimed the investigation had zeroed in on Brenda based on a detective's hunch, not on hard proof. But the evidence, though circumstantial, painted a damning and coherent picture. The jury saw the video of Brenda's cool, calculated interrogation. They heard about her flight to Mexico. They listened to Cortez's detailed, consistent account of the conspiracy. The prosecution argued that Brenda was a master manipulator who saw other people as mere instruments to achieve her goals. On June 7, 2019, after a week of testimony, the case went to the jury. It took them only 20 minutes to reach a decision. Brenda Delgado was found guilty of capital murder. The trial immediately moved to the sentencing phase, which included victim impact statements. It was a moment of raw, unrestrained grief and anger. Kendra Hatcher's mother, Bonnie Jameson, locked eyes with the woman who had stolen her daughter's future. "You, Brenda Delgado, have earned your spot here on this earth behind cold steel bars for the rest of your miserable, pathetic life," she said, her voice shaking with rage and sorrow. "And if justice could have handed you a death sentence, make no mistake, I would have been there front and center." Kendra's sister followed, her tears flowing freely as she spoke directly to Delgado. "Brenda, you're disgusting. Who the hell do you think you are? I hope you rot in hell." Brenda Delgado was formally sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She was sent to the William P. Hobby Unit, a women's prison in Marlin, Texas, where she will spend the remainder of her life. The case was closed, but the devastation it wrought remains. It is a haunting story of how love, when twisted by obsession and jealousy, can curdle into the most profound and destructive form of hate. Kendra Hatcher, a woman who spent her life creating smiles, became the victim of a plot born from a heart that had forgotten how to feel anything but rage, leaving behind a void that no verdict could ever fill. Story 2. In the spring of 2019, the London borough of Richmond-upon-Thames was a picture of idyllic English charm. It is a place of manicured gardens, riverside pubs, and the sprawling, verdant expanse of Kew Gardens, a corner of the city that feels a world away from the frantic energy of its center. On a quiet, leafy street in Kew, in a ground-floor flat, lived Laureline Garcia Bertaud. At 34, she was a woman of vibrant, creative energy, a French national from Aix-en-Provence who had made London her home and her canvas. Loreline's life was a tapestry woven from threads of passion and ambition. She was a gifted filmmaker and producer, a rising star in the independent film scene. She had recently worked with the legendary actress on a short film titled Jerry, an achievement that was a source of immense pride. She was also a talented blogger, a dog lover, and a woman with a wide, loyal circle of friends who were drawn to her warmth and her vivacious spirit. Her life was a study in motion, a constant pursuit of the next creative project, the next adventure. But beneath this bright, creative surface, a shadow lingered, a source of instability and financial worry that was a constant, low-grade hum of anxiety in her life. That shadow was her ex-boyfriend, Kirill Belousov. He was a 32-year-old Estonian, a handsome, charming man who worked in bars and nightclubs and carried himself with the swagger of a man who was destined for bigger things. He claimed to be a stuntman, boasting of work on Hollywood blockbusters like World War Z, a lie that was as audacious as it was easily disproven. Their relationship had been a long and intense one, an 8-year affair that had ended 2 years prior, in 2017. But the ties that bound them had not been fully severed. Belousov, whose life was a chaotic landscape of financial irresponsibility, owed Loreline a significant amount of money, thousands of pounds that she had lent him in good faith. For months, she had been trying to get it back, a frustrating and fruitless endeavor. Belousov was a master of evasion, a weaver of intricate, manipulative lies. He had told Loreline and others that he had cancer, a cynical, cruel fiction designed to elicit sympathy and, more importantly, to delay the repayment of his debts. In early 2019, another source of stress was pressing down on Loreline. The lease on her Q flat was ending, and she needed to find a new place to live. It was in this moment of vulnerability, of financial and housing insecurity, that Kirill Belousov re-entered her life, not as a debtor, but as a savior. He came to her with a perfect solution, an offer that seemed too good to be true. He told her he had found a new house for her, a beautiful property that he would help her secure. It was a grand gesture, a seemingly selfless act of a man who still cared for her, a man who wanted to make things right. He promised he would help her move. He promised this new beginning would be the start of a better chapter. Loreline, trusting and hopeful, believed him. She had no way of knowing that the house he was promising was a house of lies, a phantom property in a carefully constructed fantasy. She had no way of knowing that the man who was offering to help her move was, in fact, planning to move her from the world of the living to the world of the dead. The last few days of Loreline Garcia Bertaux's life were a flurry of excited preparation. The new house, the one Kirill had promised her, was a beacon of hope, a symbol of a fresh start. She began the arduous task of packing up her life, carefully wrapping her belongings, her home slowly transforming into a landscape of cardboard boxes and packing tape. She was, by all accounts, thrilled. But as the planned moving day approached, a strange and unsettling series of communications began to emanate from Loreline's phone. Her friends, who were used to her frequent and open communication, started receiving text messages that were off. The tone was not quite right, the phrasing unfamiliar. On Saturday, March 2nd, Beth Penman, one of Loreline's closest friends, received a message saying that Loreline was going on a date with a fit vet she had just met. To Beth, the message felt far-fetched, out of character for her friend, who was not in the habit of going on spontaneous dates with strangers, especially not in the midst of a stressful move. The strangeness continued. On Sunday, March 3rd, the day she was supposed to be moving, another friend received a series of texts. "I am so happy right now," one read, followed by a message explaining that her new landlord was a proper weirdo, and that she wanted to go shopping for a boob job. The messages were a bizarre cocktail of giddy excitement and strange, off-key details. They were designed to create the illusion of a woman embarking on a new, slightly chaotic adventure. But they were a fiction. Loreline Garcia Bertaux was already dead. The messages were being sent by her killer, a cynical, cruel puppet show designed to buy him time. The man behind the messages, Kirill Belousov, was at that very moment engaged in a different kind of shopping trip. On that same Sunday, CCTV cameras at a home-based hardware store in London captured him, moving through the aisles with a cold, methodical purpose. He purchased an axe, a roll of rubble sacks, and a pair of plastic clogs. The tools of concealment. The uniform of a man preparing to dispose of a body. On Monday, March 4th, the charade began to unravel. Lorline failed to show up for her job as an executive assistant at the PR firm Golan. Her colleagues were concerned. It was completely out of character for her to be a no-show. Her friends, their unease growing with every unanswered call, began to coordinate. By Tuesday, March 5th, the unease had blossomed into a full-blown panic. Beth Penman, her heart pounding with a terrible certainty that something was wrong, called the police and reported her friend missing. The police response was immediate. Officers were dispatched to the small, ground-floor flat in Kew. They knocked, but there was no answer. Forcing their way in through a back door, they were met with a scene that was both ordinary and deeply unsettling. The flat was filled with moving boxes, a testament to a life that was in the process of being packed up. The two large dogs Lorline adored were there, but they were strangely subdued, their usual boisterous energy replaced by a quiet, watchful stillness. But of Lorline, there was no trace. The search began. The officers moved through the tidy, well-kept flat, their eyes scanning for any sign of a struggle, any clue that might point to her whereabouts. And then, their search moved to the small garden at the back of the property. It was there, in a flower bed, that an officer noticed a small patch of freshly disturbed soil. A cold dread settled over the scene. They began to dig. It didn't take long. Just beneath the surface of the rich, dark earth, they found her. Lorline Garcia Bertal was buried in a shallow grave, her naked body bound and wrapped in black plastic bin bags, the same kind Belousov had been seen buying at the hardware store. The search for a missing woman was over. The hunt for a killer had just begun. The discovery of Lorline's body transformed the case from a missing person investigation into a full-blown homicide inquiry. The post-mortem examination was conducted, and the cause of death was determined with a chilling certainty. Lorline had been strangled. The ligature that had been used to end her life was still around her neck. The investigation, led by Detective Chief Inspector Simon Harding of the Metropolitan Police, immediately focused on the man who was at the center of Lorline's life in her final days, Kirill Belousov. But by the time the police had a name, their prime suspect was already gone. On Monday, March 4th, the day Lorline failed to show up for work, the day before her body would be found, Belousov had boarded a bus and fled the country, beginning a desperate, cross-continental journey back to his native Estonia. He had left behind a trail of damning evidence. The text messages, sent from Lorline's phone after she was already dead, were a transparent and cruel attempt to create a false trail, to suggest she had left of her own accord. The CCTV footage from the home-based store was a silent, black-and-white film of a killer preparing to dispose of his victim. And the most powerful piece of evidence was yet to come. Forensic analysis of the ligature found around Lorline's neck revealed a trace amount of DNA. It was a perfect match to Kirill Belousov. The police now had a clear and horrifying theory of the crime. Belousov, deeply in debt to Lorline and facing increasing pressure to repay her, had concocted a monstrous, elaborate lie. He had invented the new house, the fresh start, the offer of help. He had lured her into a state of hopeful vulnerability. And then, sometime on the weekend of March 2nd and 3rd, he had killed her. The motive, the prosecution would later argue, was as simple as it was evil. He murdered her to erase his debt. With their suspect now a fugitive in another country, the Metropolitan Police launched an international manhunt. Working with Europol, they tracked Belousov's movements. On March 13, 2019, just over a week after Lorline's body was found, he was arrested by police in Tallinn, the capital of Estonia. He was apprehended under a European arrest warrant, a legal instrument that would allow for his swift return to the UK to face justice. When he was arrested, Belousov, the master of lies, put on one final performance. He protested his innocence, telling the Estonian authorities that he wanted the investigation to prove his innocence as quickly as possible. It was a hollow, desperate plea from a man who knew the net was closing in. The son of a former Estonian police officer, he requested a speedy extradition, and at the end of March he was flown back to London, his days as a free man at an end. The stage was now set for a trial that would expose the full, chilling depth of his deception and depravity. The trial of Kirill Belousov, which took place at the Old Bailey, London's Central Criminal Court, in September of 2019, was a methodical and damning dissection of a lie. The prosecution, led by Oliver Glasgow QC, laid out the state's case against Belousov with a cold, forensic precision. They told the jury a story not of a love affair gone wrong, but of a cold-blooded, financially motivated murder, executed with a chilling degree of premeditation and covered up with a breathtakingly cruel campaign of deception. The evidence against Belousov was overwhelming. The prosecution presented the CCTV footage of him at the Homebase store, a silent, damning portrait of a man buying the tools he would use to bury his victim. They presented the DNA evidence from the ligature, a scientific certainty that placed him at the scene of the crime, his hands the last to touch the instrument of Loreline's death. And they presented the text messages, the false trail of a fit vet and a boob job, a cynical, manipulative fiction designed to mislead and delay. They also systematically dismantled the web of lies that Belousov had built his life upon. His claims of being a stuntman, of having worked on major Hollywood films, were exposed as pure fantasy. His most cruel lie, the claim that he had cancer, a fiction he had used to avoid repaying the money he owed Loreline, was also laid bare. There was no record of him ever receiving treatment at any London hospital. The judge, Nicholas Hilliard QC, would later state with a cold certainty, "I do not believe he has ever had cancer. I'm entirely sure of that. He just tells them on a scale and magnitude which I have not encountered before." Belousov, taking the stand in his own defense, continued to deny everything. He claimed he had left the country because he was in debt and under pressure, not because he was fleeing a murder scene. He maintained that he knew nothing about Loreline's death. But his testimony was riddled with inconsistencies, his story a desperate, crumbling edifice of lies. The most powerful voice in the courtroom was not that of the defendant or the prosecutor, but the voice of the victim herself, speaking through the words of her grieving mother. Frédérique Berthau's victim impact statement was read to the court, a heartbreaking testament to the immeasurable loss her family had endured. "There is not a moment during the day I don't think of my Loreline," she wrote. "I can't touch her, I can't kiss her anymore. I watch videos of her just to hear her voice, hear her laugh, to see how she moves." In his closing argument, prosecutor Oliver Glasgow painted a chilling picture of Loreline's final moments. "The last few minutes of Ms. Garcia Bertau's life must have been truly terrifying as this defendant squeezed the very life out of her," he told the jury. "And as she struggled for her final breath, there must have been a moment of terrible clarity when she realized that the man she cared for was a liar, a cheat, and a killer." On September 30th, 2019, the jury returned with its verdict. Kirill Belousov was found guilty of the murder of Loreline Garcia Bertau. A few days later, he was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 24 years. In his sentencing remarks, the judge captured the essence of the crime's unique cruelty. "I'm entirely satisfied the defendant is not someone who believes the lies he tells," he said, acknowledging the cold, manipulative nature of Belousov's character. Detective Chief Inspector Simon Harding, who had led the investigation, echoed that sentiment. "I cannot imagine what thoughts were going through Loreline's mind," he said, "when the man she trusted, who had promised to help her move to a beautiful new home after months of worry over her housing situation, turned instead into a killer who took away her life." The story of Loreline Garcia Bertau is a tragedy born of a monstrous, calculated deception. It is a story of a vibrant, creative life extinguished for the most pathetic of reasons, a debt that a man was unwilling or unable to repay. It is a story of a killer who was not a shadowy stranger, but a trusted ex-partner, a man who used the intimacy of a shared history as a weapon. Kirill Belousov, the would-be stuntman, the liar, the cheat, and the killer, will now spend the rest of his life behind bars, his world reduced to the four walls of a prison cell. But for the family and friends of Loreline, the sentence brings no real closure, only the cold comfort of a legal resolution. The house of lies that Borisov built has been demolished, but the beautiful life that was destroyed in its construction can never be rebuilt. The light of Loreline Garcia Bertal was extinguished, but the memory of her talent, her warmth, and her spirit endures, a heartbreaking testament to all that was lost. Story 3. The evening of August 14th, 2025, settled over the sprawling, sun-baked landscape of Southern California's inland empire with the familiar, weary heat of a late summer day. In Yucaipa, a city nestled at the foot of the San Bernardino Mountains, the strip malls and vast parking lots shimmered in the fading light. It was a landscape of mundane, everyday life, a world of errands and commutes, a place where nothing of consequence was supposed to happen. In the parking lot of a Big Five sporting goods store on Yucaipa Boulevard, that illusion was about to be shattered by a mother's frantic, terrified scream. The call came into the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Office at 7:47 p.m. The voice on the line belonged to 41-year-old Rebecca Harrow. Her story was every parent's most primal nightmare. She told the dispatcher that she had been outside her vehicle, changing the diaper of her 7-month-old son, Emmanuel, when she was viciously attacked from behind by an unknown man. She had been rendered unconscious, she said, and when she came to, her baby was gone. The response was immediate and massive. The specter of a stranger abduction, a child snatched from his mother's side in a public place, is a 5-alarm fire for law enforcement. Deputies swarmed the Big Five parking lot, their patrol car lights painting the asphalt in frantic strokes of red and blue. The area was cordoned off, a crime scene established. Detectives from the Specialized Enforcement Division were called in, their faces grim as they absorbed the details of the mother's horrific account. The initial public narrative was one of pure, unambiguous tragedy. A young mother had been assaulted, her infant son kidnapped. The story spread like wildfire across local news and social media. An Amber Alert was issued, the digital cry for help carrying Emmanuel's baby picture into the homes and onto the phones of millions of Californians. His face, round and cherubic, looked out from the screen, a silent, innocent victim of a monstrous, random act of violence. The community held its breath, praying for a miracle, for the safe return of a baby who had been stolen from the world. But in the sterile, quiet interrogation rooms of the sheriff's department, a different story was beginning to take shape. As detectives spoke with Rebecca Harrow, as they pressed her for details, for a description of her attacker, for the precise sequence of events, cracks began to appear in the foundation of her narrative. The details were vague, shifting. The story, under the weight of scrutiny, began to feel thin, insubstantial. The investigators, trained to detect the subtle dissonances of a lie, grew skeptical. There were, as they would later state in a carefully worded press release, inconsistencies in her initial statement. 2 days after the initial report, the official tone of the investigation shifted dramatically. The search for a mysterious, unknown male abductor was quietly abandoned. The investigators declared that they were now unable to rule out foul play in the disappearance of Emmanuel Harrow. The focus of the investigation was turning inward, away from the phantom in the parking lot and towards the two people who should have been Emmanuel's ultimate protectors, his mother, Rebecca, and his 32-year-old father, Jake Harrow. The nightmare had not begun in a parking lot. It had begun, the police now suspected, in the one place Emmanuel should have been safest, his own home. The home of Jake and Rebecca Harrow was in Cabazon, a small, unincorporated community in the San Gorgonio Pass, a windswept corridor of desert known for its giant dinosaur statues and outlet malls. It was a place of transient beauty, a landscape that felt both vast and claustrophobic. As the investigation turned towards the parents, this home became the epicenter of the search. Detectives executed a series of search warrants, combing through the house, the yard, the cars, looking for any trace of the missing child, any evidence of the violence they now believed had taken place there. As they dug into the parents' lives, a dark and disturbing history began to emerge, a history that centered on Jake Harrow. He was not just a father. He was, in the words of Riverside County District Attorney Michael Hestron, an experienced child abuser. In 2018, Jake had been convicted of abusing another child, an infant daughter he had with his ex-wife. The abuse was so severe that the child was left permanently bedridden. For that crime, a crime that had destroyed a child's life, Jake Harrow had not gone to prison. In what Hestron would later call an outrageous error in judgment, a judge had granted him probation. If that judge had done his job as he should have done, Hestron would later declare with a cold fury, Emmanuel would be alive today. The revelation cast a sickening pall over the case. This was not the first time Jake Harrow had been at the center of a story of child abuse. The system had given him a second chance, a chance he had used, prosecutors now believed, to create a second victim. The disappearance of Emmanuel was not a random act of violence, but the predictable, tragic culmination of a pattern, a cycle of abuse that the justice system had failed to break. With the parents' story now in tatters and Jake's violent past laid bare, the investigators continued to apply pressure. They knew the kidnapping story was a fabrication. They believed Emmanuel was dead, and they believed that his parents knew where his body was. On August 22nd, just over a week after the initial report, the charade came to an end. Jake and Rebecca Harrow were arrested at their home in Cabazon. The charge was murder. The arrests marked a significant turning point, but they did not end the search. The focus simply shifted from a search for a living child to a grim, desperate hunt for his remains. A few days after his arrest, Jake Harrow, now clad in a jail jumpsuit, was taken from his cell and driven to a remote, desolate stretch of desert in Southern California. Accompanied by detectives and cadaver dogs, he appeared to participate in a search, a silent, shackled figure walking through the barren landscape, pointing to patches of empty earth. The search concluded, as it would so many times, with a heartbreaking declaration. Emmanuel was not located. The desert held its secrets close. The legal proceedings began with a show of defiance. On September 4th, 2025, Jake and Rebecca Harrow, appearing in court with their court-appointed attorneys, pleaded not guilty to the charges of murder and filing a false police report. Bail was set at $1 million for each of them. They were, in the eyes of the law, still presumed innocent, their pleas a formal denial of the monstrous crime they were accused of committing. The case was now a no-body homicide prosecution, a rare and difficult legal challenge where the state must prove a murder without the primary piece of evidence, the victim's body. At a press conference following the arraignment, District Attorney Michael Hestron stood before a wall of cameras and laid out the state's grim theory of the case. He told the world that Emmanuel was not just dead, he was believed to have been severely abused over a period of time, and that he had eventually succumbed to those injuries. He stated that both parents would have been aware of that abuse. The story of the kidnapping was a lie, a cynical and desperate attempt to cover up a months-long campaign of torture that had ended in the death of a helpless infant. He also announced that despite the ongoing searches, authorities had a pretty strong indication of the location of the baby's remains. It was a statement of confidence, but it was also a statement that underscored the agonizing reality that Emmanuel was still out there, somewhere, his final resting place a secret held by the two people who had given him life and then, allegedly, taken it away. The legal battle had just begun, but the human tragedy was already immeasurable. For a month, the case proceeded along the slow, deliberate track of the justice system. Motions were filed, hearings were scheduled. Jake and Rebecca Harrow remained behind bars, their public posture one of unwavering denial. But behind the scenes, the weight of his crime and the mountain of evidence the state was compiling against him was pressing down on Jake Harrow. The man who had a history of violence, who had already destroyed the life of one child, was now facing the prospect of spending the rest of his life in prison for the murder of another. The pressure was building, and something was about to break. On Thursday, October 16th, 2025, The two defendants were back in court for a procedural hearing. But what happened that day was anything but procedural. As the hearing began, Jake Harrow, the man who had stoically pleaded not guilty just a month before, suddenly dramatically fell apart. He began to cry, his body racked with sobs. Through his tears, he spoke to his attorney, and then, his voice choked with emotion, he addressed the court. "I want to plead guilty," he said. The courtroom was stunned into silence. He pleaded guilty to all charges: second-degree murder, assault causing bodily harm to a child resulting in the death of that child, and filing a false police report. It was a full and complete confession, a sudden and shocking capitulation. The facade was gone, replaced by the raw, pathetic spectacle of a killer's belated, self-serving remorse. While Jake broke down, his wife, Rebecca, the woman who had first spun the tale of the kidnapping, remained silent. Through her attorney, she pleaded not guilty to an amended complaint, her resolve unbroken, her denial absolute. The unholy alliance, if it had ever truly existed, was now shattered. The confession of Jake Harrow was a legal victory for the prosecution, but it was a human tragedy that offered no real catharsis. It did not bring Emmanuel back, and most cruelly, it did not reveal his resting place. The plea came with no agreement to cooperate, no promise to lead the authorities to the place where he had hidden his son's body. The secret remained his, a final, sadistic exertion of control over a family he had already destroyed. On Monday, November 3rd, 2025, Jake Harrow returned to the courtroom for the final act of his legal drama. The sentencing hearing was a somber affair, a formal acknowledgement of a crime that was still, in a fundamental way, incomplete. The most powerful voice in the room that day was not that of the judge, the prosecutor, or the defense attorney. It was the voice of Mary Buchan, Emmanuel's maternal grandmother. She stood before the court, her voice trembling with a grief that was still as raw as it was on the day her grandson disappeared. She spoke not just of the loss of Emmanuel, but of the destruction of her own daughter, Rebecca. "He destroyed my family," she said, her words a direct, damning indictment of the man who sat just feet away. "Everybody in my family, all my children are destroyed by this." She spoke of the change she had seen in her daughter after she had entered Jake's life, a change she could not understand, but that she now saw with a horrifying clarity. "He changed my daughter. We don't know who she is," she told the court. "He kept my daughter away. I don't know what he did or how he changed my daughter's life, but she was never that same person after she went to live with him." Her statement was a heartbreaking portrait of a family torn apart not just by a murder, but by the slow, insidious poison of abuse and control. She asked for the longest possible sentence. "I don't want to give him another chance," she said, her voice full of a righteous, grandmotherly fury. The judge, taking into account the brutality of the crime and the defendant's own confession, sentenced Jake Harrow to 25 years to life in prison. He was led from the courtroom, his future now a long, bleak expanse of prison walls and barred windows. Justice, in its legal form, had been served. But the story of Emmanuel Harrow does not end there. It ends, for now, in a place of agonizing uncertainty. His body has never been found. His final resting place is a secret that his father has, to this day, refused to reveal. His mother, Rebecca, still awaits her own trial, her plea of not guilty a final, defiant echo of the lie that started it all. The case of Emmanuel Harrow is a story of almost unimaginable cruelty, a story of a life that was not just taken, but was, in the words of the prosecutor who sought justice for him, erased by a campaign of abuse. It is a story about the failure of a system that allowed an experienced child abuser to walk free, to create a new family, and to repeat his monstrous crimes. And it is a story of a family's unending grief, a grief that is compounded by the terrible reality that they cannot even give their child a proper burial. Somewhere in the vast, unforgiving landscape of the Southern California desert, a 7-month-old baby lies in an unmarked grave, his story a tragic, haunting testament to the darkest depths of human evil and the enduring, aching pain of a love that has nowhere to go. The search for Emmanuel Harrow is not over. It has simply transformed from a search for a missing child to a search for a final measure of peace. Story 4. In the quiet, flat landscape of Del Mar, a town that straddles the border between Delaware and Maryland, life unfolds with a gentle, predictable rhythm. It is a place of small, tight-knit communities, where the changing seasons are marked by the harvest of corn and soybeans, and the air carries the faint, briny scent of the not-so-distant Atlantic. Here, family roots run deep, and the world can feel small, safe, and contained. In the autumn of 2010, this was the world of Whitney Lynn Bennett. At 23, she was a young woman whose life was a whirlwind of the beautiful, chaotic, and often demanding work of motherhood. Whitney was a daughter, a friend, but above all, she was a mother to 3 beautiful children. 2 sons, Brian and Aaliyah, and a daughter, Jayla. Her days were a tapestry woven with the threads of their needs: the school runs, the scraped knees, the bedtime stories, the boundless, unconditional love that defined her existence. She was a homemaker, her world centered on the small house on Susan Beach Road, a place she was trying to build into a sanctuary for her young family. She was, by all accounts, a devoted mother, a young woman who, despite the challenges of her life, found her deepest joy and purpose in her children. But there was a shadow that fell across this idyllic picture of young motherhood, a source of instability and turmoil that was a constant presence in her life. His name was William A. Hill. He was Whitney's on and off boyfriend, a man whose life was a revolving door of trouble with the law. Their relationship was a volatile one, a cycle of breakups and reconciliations, a push and pull of affection and conflict. For Whitney's family, particularly her mother, Robin, William was a source of constant worry. They saw the instability he brought into their daughter's life, the chaos that always seemed to follow in his wake. They wanted better for her, for their grandchildren. But Whitney, caught in the powerful, often confusing currents of a difficult love, kept going back. As the holiday season approached in late 2010, the air grew crisp and the first hints of winter settled over the Delmarva Peninsula. Whitney was navigating the familiar, complex terrain of her life, managing her home, caring for her children, and dealing with the ever-present drama of her relationship with William Hill. She was a young woman with a bright smile and a warm heart, a woman who was loved. She had no way of knowing that she was standing on the precipice of a great and terrible darkness, that the familiar shadow that had long lingered at the edges of her life was about to coalesce into a monstrous force that would swallow her whole, leaving behind a silence so profound it would take years to fully comprehend. On Saturday, December 4th, 2010, Whitney Bennett was seen for the last time. She was in Wicomico County, Maryland, the neighboring county to her Delaware home. The specific circumstances of her last known hours are shrouded in the fog of time and the secrecy of those who hold the truth. But what is known is that after that day, she vanished. The first few days of her absence were not, on their face, a cause for immediate panic. The volatile nature of her relationship with William Hill meant that her comings and goings could sometimes be erratic. But as the days stretched on with no word, a cold dread began to seep into the hearts of her family. Whitney lived for her children. It was unthinkable that she would voluntarily leave them, that she would not call, not check in, not be there to tuck them into bed at night. The silence from her phone, the unanswered calls that echoed into a digital void, became a terrifying drumbeat of wrongness. On Thursday, December 9th, 5 days after she was last seen, her mother, Robin, could bear the agonizing uncertainty no longer. She went to the Delaware State Police and filed a missing person report. The initial response from the authorities was measured, tempered by the hard-won experience of dealing with the often messy lives of young adults. A 23-year-old with a tumultuous relationship history. It was a story they had heard before. A local sheriff, at the outset, they did not suspect foul play. It was treated as a standard missing person case, with the implicit, unspoken hope that she would turn up in a few days. A fight with her boyfriend resolved, her brief, unexplained absence a temporary disruption in the rhythm of her life. But her family knew better. They knew Whitney. This was not a lover's quarrel. This was not a young woman taking a few days to clear her head. This was an aberration, a tear in the very fabric of who she was. It was almost as if she had left one day and decided never to return, one chronicler of the case would later write. But her family knew that something had to have been wrong. That wrongness settled over them like a shroud. The holiday season, a time of light and celebration, was transformed into a season of darkness and dread. The search for Whitney Bennett had begun, a search that would stretch through the cold winter months and into the first tentative days of spring, a search that would lead them, and the investigators who had finally begun to share their sense of urgency, to a desolate, wooded property and a shallow, makeshift grave. For 4 long, agonizing months, the life of the Bennett family was suspended in a state of limbo. Winter settled over the eastern shore, blanketing the landscape in a cold, gray light that mirrored the despair in their hearts. Every day they woke with a single burning question: where is Whitney? And every night they went to bed with that question unanswered, the not knowing a form of torture more cruel than any certainty. The Wicomico County Bureau of Investigation, having taken over the case due to Whitney's last known whereabouts, began the slow, methodical work of trying to trace a ghost. They interviewed friends and family, piecing together a picture of her life, her relationships, her habits. And at the center of that picture, casting a long and ominous shadow, was William Hill. He was a person of interest from the very beginning. His history, his volatile relationship with Whitney, his presence in her life in the days leading up to her disappearance, it all pointed in his direction. But pointing and proving are 2 very different things. There was no physical evidence, no crime scene, no body. There was only a missing woman and a man who was surrounded by a cloud of suspicion. As it happened, William Hill was not a free man. At the time of Whitney's disappearance, he was already facing legal troubles of his own, held at the Wicomico County Detention Center on unrelated abuse charges. His incarceration both complicated and simplified the investigation. It meant he was not an immediate, ongoing threat to the community, but it also meant that he was in a controlled environment, surrounded by other inmates, his conversations and movements constrained. He was a captive audience and a captive suspect. As the investigation into Whitney's disappearance continued, the winter of 2010 bled into the spring of 2011. The snow melted, the ground thawed, and the first green shoots of new life began to push their way through the cold earth. For the Bennett family, the change of seasons brought no relief, only a deepening sense of dread. The hope that Whitney might still be alive, that she might one day walk back through the door, was beginning to wither. Then in April the break came. It did not come from a dogged piece of detective work, or a lucky traffic stop, or a sudden pang of conscience from someone who knew something. It came in the form of a whisper, a secret passed from an unknown source to the authorities. An anonymous tip came in, a voice from the shadows, guiding the investigators to a specific location, a large, unoccupied property in rural Somerset County, the county just south of Wicomico. The tip was chillingly specific. It told them where to look. It told them they would find a body. Armed with the tip and a search warrant, a team of investigators and crime scene technicians descended on the several acres of desolate, wooded land. The search was methodical, grim. They moved through the trees, their eyes scanning the ground, looking for any disturbance, any sign that the earth had been recently turned. And then they found it, a patch of ground that was not quite right, a makeshift grave. They began to dig. With each shovel full of dirt, the terrible truth of the anonymous tip was confirmed. They uncovered the body of a woman. It was Whitney. After 4 months of agonizing uncertainty, the search was over. But the discovery of her body only opened a new, even more horrifying chapter in the family's grief. Their daughter, their mother, their friend, had not just disappeared. She had been murdered, and her body discarded in a shallow grave, left to the cold indifference of the forest. The discovery immediately transformed the case. What had been a missing person investigation was now, unequivocally, a homicide. But the state of Whitney's body, after 4 months in the ground, presented a significant challenge for the forensic examiners. They could not determine a definitive cause of death. There were no obvious signs of gunshot wounds or blunt force trauma that had survived the ravages of time and decomposition. The official cause of death was ruled as undetermined. It was a frustrating, maddening conclusion, a medical determination that seemed to fly in the face of the stark, undeniable reality of a young woman buried in a secret grave. But for the investigators, the undetermined cause of death was a legal hurdle, not a practical one. They knew this was a homicide, and they knew, with a growing sense of certainty, who was responsible. The anonymous tip, they believed, was a crack in the wall of silence that had been built around William Hill. The secret of what had happened to Whitney Bennett was a burden too heavy to be carried alone, and someone had finally buckled under its weight. The focus of the investigation narrowed, with an almost laser-like intensity, on the man who was already sitting in a jail cell, the man who was at the center of Whitney's troubled life, and who, they were now convinced, was at the center of her death. The key to unlocking the case of Whitney Bennett's murder was not found in a fingerprint, a DNA sample, or a forgotten piece of physical evidence. It was found in the whispers and secrets of the Wicomico County Detention Center, a place where information is a form of currency, and a well-placed confession can buy a man his freedom. With William Hill already in custody on unrelated charges, the investigators had a captive suspect. They also had a captive audience. They knew that in the pressure cooker environment of a jail, secrets have a way of coming to the surface. They just had to wait. The break came from an informant, a fellow inmate who had gained William Hill's trust. This source, whose identity was kept confidential for their own protection, came to the authorities with a story that was both shocking and chillingly plausible. According to the informant, William Hill, in a moment of unguarded confession, had admitted to murdering Whitney. But he hadn't done it alone. He had help. He told the informant that he and his father, Claude H. Hill, had killed Whitney and buried her in the woods. It was a stunning breakthrough, a confession that not only implicated William Hill, but also expanded the circle of conspiracy to include his own father. The story explained so much: the disappearance, the body in the shallow grave, the cold, hard silence that had followed. The investigators now had a narrative, a theory of the crime that was supported by a direct confession, albeit one that had been made to a jailhouse informant, a source whose credibility would inevitably be challenged in court. But the informant's story didn't end there. There was another, even more bizarre and disturbing layer to the conspiracy. A second source came forward, this one with information about William Hill's stepbrother, Stephen L. Akers. According to this source, Akers had been enlisted to help with the cover-up after the fact. His alleged role was as macabre as it was audacious. He had helped install 2 cameras at the burial site, a surveillance system set up to monitor the area around Whitney's makeshift grave. The implications of this revelation were staggering. It suggested a crime that was not just a spontaneous act of violence, but a cold, calculated murder that was followed by an equally cold and calculated cover-up. The idea of setting up cameras to watch over a victim's grave spoke to a level of paranoia and depravity that was hard to comprehend. Were they watching to make sure the body was not discovered? Were they monitoring the comings and goings of law enforcement? Or was it something even more twisted, a desire to maintain a kind of grotesque, remote control over the final resting place of their victim? With the informant's testimony, the investigators now had a clear path forward. The pieces of the puzzle, which had been scattered and disconnected for so long, were finally beginning to form a coherent, horrifying picture. They had the motive, a volatile, abusive relationship that had reached a fatal breaking point. They had the means, a murder committed in secret. They had the location, the desolate patch of woods in Somerset County. And now they had the conspirators, a son, a father, and a stepbrother, a family bound together not by blood and love, but by a shared murderous secret. In April of 2011, shortly after Whitney's body was found, the authorities made their move. They charged Claude H. Hill, the father, and his stepson, Stephen L. Akers, with being accessories after the fact and with obstruction of justice. A week later, they brought the most serious charges against the man at the center of the web. William A. Hill was charged with the first and second-degree murder of Whitney Bennett. The charges sent a shockwave through the community. The disappearance that had haunted the region for months finally had a resolution of a sort. But the resolution was as horrifying as the crime itself. A young mother had been murdered, allegedly at the hands of the man who was supposed to love her, a man who had then enlisted his own family to help him hide his terrible secret. The silence that had surrounded the case for so long had been a family pact, a conspiracy of silence that had been broken by a single, whispered confession in the confines of a county jail. The legal battle for justice for Whitney Bennett was about to begin. The legal proceedings against William Hill and his family were a long and complicated affair, a journey through a justice system that moves with a slow, deliberate pace. For the Bennett family, it was another form of agonizing waiting, a limbo between the horror of what had happened and the hope for a final, legal accountability. The case against William Hill was built almost entirely on the testimony of the jailhouse informant. This presented a significant challenge for the prosecution. The defense would undoubtedly attack the informant's credibility, painting him as an opportunist who was fabricating a story in exchange for a lighter sentence on his own charges. The lack of a definitive cause of death from the autopsy report was another major hurdle. Without being able to say exactly how Whitney was killed, the prosecution would have to rely on the power of the circumstantial evidence and the chilling narrative of the confession. The cases against Claude Hill and Stephen Akers were even more complex, resting on the fine legal distinctions of what it means to be an accessory to a crime. Did they know about the murder? And if so, what did they do to help cover it up? The story of the cameras in the woods, if it could be proven, would be a powerful piece of evidence, a clear act of obstruction. As the cases moved through the pretrial motions and hearings, the full, tragic scope of Whitney's story was laid bare. She was not just a name in a case file, not just a victim. She was a mother whose 3 children were now growing up without her, their lives forever altered by a single act of violence. The court proceedings were a constant, painful reminder of the human cost of the crime, the ripple effect of a single death that had devastated a family and a community. Ultimately, the resolution of the case did not come in a dramatic, televised trial. It came, as it so often does, in the quiet, negotiated world of plea bargains. The details of the final legal outcomes are not as widely reported as the sensational facts of the crime itself. But what is known is that justice, in its imperfect, legalistic way, was pursued. William Hill, the man at the center of the storm, was held accountable for his role in the death of the woman he claimed to love. The story of Whitney Bennett is a tragic and cautionary tale. It is a story about the hidden dangers of domestic abuse, about the way a volatile relationship can escalate into a fatal one. It is a story about the complicity of family, about a bond that was twisted to conceal a murder rather than to nurture a life. And it is a story about the slow, often frustrating, but ultimately persistent nature of justice. In the end, it was not forensic science or a brilliant piece of detective work that solved the case. It was a human voice, a whisper in a jail cell, a secret that became too heavy to bear. That voice gave Whitney's family the one thing they had been denied for 4 long months, an answer. It was a horrific answer, but it was an answer nonetheless. It brought Whitney home, and it set in motion the process that would ensure that the men responsible for silencing her voice would not be allowed to walk free, their terrible secret held forever in the silence of their own making. The silence of Susan Beach Road was finally and irrevocably broken. Story 5. The Indian River in Brevard County, Florida, is not really a river at all. It is a lagoon, a sprawling, brackish estuary that separates the mainland from the barrier islands that line the state's Atlantic coast. It is a place of serene, natural beauty, where dolphins arc through the calm waters and manatees drift like gentle, submerged blimps. The air here, in the heat of a Florida summer, is thick with the scent of salt and mangrove, a place where life moves with the slow, languid rhythm of the tides. In July of 2000, this tranquil body of water was about to give up a terrible secret, a story of a vibrant life brutally extinguished and a mystery that would take years, and a scientific breakthrough that was the stuff of science fiction to finally solve. At the heart of that story was Misty April Morse. At 22, Misty was a young woman who seemed to embody the sun-drenched, carefree spirit of her coastal Florida home. Born in Ohio, she had moved to Indian Harbor Beach with her mother, Linda, and was a beloved fixture in the local community. Her friends describe her as a friend magnet, a girl with an infectious, bubbly personality who collected friends as easily as other people collected seashells on the beach. She was a waitress, her days a familiar rhythm of serving customers, sharing stories, and living the kind of untethered life that is the hallmark of young adulthood. She was, by all accounts, a beautiful, free spirit, a young woman with a wide-open future stretching out before her like the endless expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The night of Thursday, July 20th, 2000, began in the ordinary, domestic comfort of the home she shared with her mother. Misty was getting ready for a night out with friends, the air in the small house filled with the scent of her shampoo and the buzz of her hairdryer. She was in high spirits, looking forward to a night of music and laughter. She told her mother she would be home by morning, a casual promise, the kind of farewell that is exchanged 1,000 times between a child and a parent. Her mother, Kim, left for her own job at 3 a.m., the house quiet, her daughter out in the world, living her life. It was the last time she would ever see her alive. The next 2 days were a slow, creeping crescendo of unease. When Misty didn't return home, her parents, at first, were not overly concerned. Misty was an adult, a free spirit. It was not entirely out of character for her to spend a night or two with friends. But as the hours stretched into days, and the calls to her cell phone went unanswered, the unease began to curdle into a cold, hard knot of fear. This was different. This was not Misty. Unbeknownst to them, the first chapter of their nightmare had already been written. On Sunday, July 23rd, boaters on the calm, sun-dappled waters of the Indian River, near the Merrill P. Barber Bridge in Vero Beach, made a grim discovery. A body was floating in the lagoon, a pale, indistinct shape bobbing in the gentle current. The police were called, and the tranquil waterway was transformed into a crime scene. The body that was pulled from the warm, brackish water was in a state of advanced decomposition, the features bloated and rendered unrecognizable by 3 days of immersion in the Florida heat. It was the body of a woman, naked and bound. Her hands and feet were tied together with a distinctive red and white nautical rope, the kind with a unique double diamond pattern. The knots used to bind her were equally specific, a cow hitch, a knot commonly taught and used in the Coast Guard and other maritime professions. Her head and neck were wrapped in white duct tape, and her body had been weighed down with plastic bags from the Publix supermarket, a futile attempt to keep her submerged, to keep her secrets hidden in the murky depths of the lagoon. The first, most urgent task for the investigators of the Brevard County Sheriff's Office was to answer the most basic of questions. Who was she? The state of the body made visual identification impossible, but the investigators, in a feat of grim, ingenious forensics, were able to find a way. Using a technique known as degloving, they carefully made an incision around the victim's wrists, peeling back the outer layer of skin from her hands like a glove. From this preserved skin, they were able to lift a set of fingerprints. The prints were run through the state database, and a match came back almost immediately. The Jane Doe of the Indian River had a name. She was Misty April Morse. Her prints were on file from a minor, misdemeanor arrest some time back, a small, forgotten transgression that now served as her final, posthumous introduction to the world. The news that the body was Misty's was a devastating blow to her family. The agonizing uncertainty of her disappearance had been replaced by the brutal finality of her murder. The investigation, now with a victim and an identity, began in earnest. The medical examiner, due to the extreme decomposition, was unable to determine a definitive cause of death. There were no broken bones, no gunshot wounds, no obvious signs of trauma that had survived the 3 days in the water. Had she been strangled? Had she been suffocated by the duct tape that covered her mouth and nose? Had she been drowned? The science could not say for sure. But one thing was certain. This was a homicide, a brutal and deeply personal one. The investigators now had a victim, a crime scene, and a collection of bizarre, specific clues. What they needed was a killer. The search would lead them into the heart of Misty's life, into her circle of friends and lovers, and to a man whose expertise in boats and knots made him a prime suspect from the very beginning. The investigation into the murder of Misty Morse began with the painstaking work of reconstructing her life, her relationships, and her final days. Detectives began interviewing her friends, her family, anyone and everyone who might be able to shed some light on who would have wanted to harm this vibrant, well-loved young woman. And as they delved into her world, one name kept coming up: Brent Huck. At 33, Brent Huck was a man who seemed to embody a certain kind of rugged, masculine ideal. He was a former Navy SEAL, a charter boat captain, a man who made his living on the water. He was handsome, confident, and he had been, until recently, Misty's boyfriend. Their relationship, friends said, had been a serious one. They had even lived together for a time. But it had also been a volatile one, and it had ended, leaving behind a residue of unresolved emotion. The investigators' interest in Huck sharpened when they learned the details of the crime scene. The specific nautical rope, the expertly tied cowhitch knots. It all pointed to someone with a maritime background, someone who knew their way around a boat. Brent Huck, the charter boat captain and former Navy SEAL, fit that profile perfectly. The detectives went to Huck's waterfront home to question him. The house itself was a treasure trove of circumstantial evidence. In his kitchen and bedroom, they found items that were eerily similar to the materials used in the murder. White duct tape, Publix supermarket bags, and a black rubber spline, the kind used to secure screens and windows, that matched the cord used to weigh down Misty's body. The coincidences were piling up, each one adding another layer to the growing cloud of suspicion that was gathering around him. Outside, docked in the waterway behind his house, was his boat. Huck, cooperative and seemingly unconcerned, gave the officers permission to search it. Inside, they found 2 strands of long, dark hair on the floor, and more matted hair near a fishing rod holder. They also found rope that matched the distinctive red and white nautical rope that had been used to bind Misty's hands and feet. During the search, Huck made a statement that would later be seen as a crucial, damning slip. He told the investigators there couldn't be an explanation for a woman tied up and thrown in the river. At that point in the investigation, the details of how Misty's body had been found, the fact that she had been tied up, had not been released to the public. How did he know? It was a piece of knowledge that only the killer and the police could possess. It was a classic, self-incriminating blunder, the kind of mistake that detectives live for. With this mountain of circumstantial evidence, the investigators felt they had their man. They had a suspect with the means, the knowledge, and a plausible, if still unproven, motive rooted in a failed relationship. They had his suspicious statement. They had the physical evidence from his home and his boat that seemed to tie him directly to the crime. They took their case to the state attorney, confident that an arrest was imminent. But the prosecutors were hesitant. The evidence, they argued, was compelling, but it was not conclusive. It was all circumstantial. The rope, the duct tape, the plastic bags, these were all common household items. Anyone could own them. And the hair on the boat, it proved only that Misty, his recent ex-girlfriend, had been on his boat at some point, a fact that was not in dispute. There was no direct, physical evidence that definitively linked Brent Huck to Misty's body. There was no smoking gun. The prosecutors, reluctant to move forward with a case that they felt was not a guaranteed conviction, sent the detectives back to the drawing board. They needed more. For the investigators, and for Misty's family, it was a devastating setback. They were convinced they had their killer, but he remained free, protected by a legal standard of proof that their powerful, but circumstantial, case could not yet meet. The investigation stalled. The months turned into a year, and then 2. The case grew cold. It seemed as though Brent Huck, the man who had the knowledge, the means, and a web of suspicion woven tightly around him, was going to get away with murder. The science of 2000 had taken the investigation as far as it could go. It would take a scientific revolution and a landmark case from the other side of the country to finally provide the missing link that would leash the killer to his crime. The break in the case of Misty Morse, when it finally came, was born not in an interrogation room in Florida, but in a courtroom in California. In 2002, a landmark ruling in a California case established a legal precedent that would change the face of forensic science forever. For the first time, a court had allowed the use of canine DNA as evidence in a criminal trial. It was a revolutionary development, one that opened up a whole new avenue of forensic investigation. For the detectives in Brevard County, this news was a jolt of electricity to a case that had been dormant for 2 long years. They remembered a small, seemingly insignificant detail from the original crime scene evidence, a detail that now, in the light of this new legal precedent, took on a monumental importance. Stuck to the white duct tape that had been wrapped around Misty's head and neck, forensic technicians had found several strands of black hair. But the hair was not human. It was animal hair, most likely from a dog. At the time, there was nothing they could do with it. It was a clue without a key. But now they had a key. The investigators also remembered something else. During their search of Brent Huck's home back in 2000, they had encountered his dog, a large, black dog named Chiba. They had, with a foresight that would prove to be brilliant, collected and preserved hair samples from Chiba for comparison, a standard, if at the time seemingly futile, part of their evidence collection. Now, with the new legal precedent and the preserved samples, they had a path forward. The dog hairs from the duct tape on Misty's body and the hair samples from Huck's dog, Chiba, were sent to a specialized lab on the West Coast, one of the few places in the world that was equipped to perform this new cutting-edge canine DNA analysis. The wait for the results was agonizing. The entire case, their 2 years of suspicion and frustration, now hinged on the microscopic genetic code of a dog. Weeks later, the results came back. It was a perfect match. The DNA from the dog hair found on the duct tape that had been used to bind and suffocate Misty Morse was identical to the DNA of Brent Huck's dog, Chiba. It was the smoking gun they had been searching for. It was the direct, physical, scientific link that tied the materials used in the murder directly to the prime suspect. The circumstantial case was now a forensic certainty. The common household items, the tape, the rope, were no longer just suspicious coincidences. They were part of a chain of evidence that led directly to Brent Huck's front door. The dog, a loyal companion, had become a silent, unwitting witness, its shed hairs a biological betrayal that would finally bring its master to justice. The investigators now had a new theory of the crime, a narrative that incorporated the false rumors that had been circulating about Misty at the time of her disappearance. Friends had told the police that there was a rumor, though it was untrue, that Misty was pregnant. The investigators now believed that this rumor may have been the catalyst for the murder. They theorized that Huck, upon hearing the rumor, had confronted Misty, that the confrontation had escalated, and that he had strangled her in a fit of rage, then disposed of her body in the river in a panicked, desperate attempt to cover up his crime. On October 23, 2002, more than 2 years after he had murdered his ex-girlfriend and left her to rot in the Indian River, Brent Huck was arrested and charged with the first-degree murder and felony kidnapping of Misty Morse. The man who Misty's father, Bob, would later call a gutless coward, was finally in custody. The science and the shed hairs of a dog had caught a killer. The long, cold wait for justice was finally over. The trial of Brent Huck, which took place in 2003, was a showcase for the power of modern forensic science. The prosecution laid out the case against him with a methodical, almost surgical precision. They presented the jury with the mountain of circumstantial evidence: the nautical rope, the specific knots, the Publix bags, the white duct tape, all items that were found in Huck's possession. They reminded the jury of his suspicious, self-incriminating statement to the police, his knowledge of details that only the killer could have known. But the centerpiece of their case, the evidence that transformed suspicion into certainty, was the dog hair. They brought in the forensic experts who had conducted the canine DNA analysis, who explained to the jury in clear, simple terms the science that had linked the hairs on the duct tape to Huck's dog, Chiba. It was a powerful, almost unassailable piece of physical evidence, a direct link between the instrument of the murder and the man who had wielded it. Huck's defense team did their best to attack the evidence. They argued that the case was still circumstantial, that the dog hair proved only that Misty might have come into contact with the dog at some point, not that Huck had killed her. But the story was too specific, the coincidences too numerous, the science too powerful. In the end, the jury agreed. Brent Huck was found guilty of the first-degree murder and kidnapping of Misty Morse. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences in a Florida prison, a sentence that ensured he would never again walk free. In the years since his conviction, Brent Huck has continued to maintain his innocence. He has filed appeals, claiming that he was the victim of a flawed investigation, that the real killer was another of Misty's ex-boyfriends, a man named Teddy Underwood. His attorneys have argued for a new trial, bringing forward witnesses who claimed that Underwood had a history of choking other women. But the courts have consistently rejected his appeals, upholding the conviction that was built on a foundation of solid, scientific evidence. For the family of Misty Morse, the conviction of Brent Huck brought a measure of justice, but it could not erase the pain of their loss. "I hope he lives 1,000 years, her father Bob said after the trial, his words a testament to a grief that would never fade, and remembers every day what he did to Misty. The case of Misty Morse is a chilling story of a vibrant life cut short, of a killer who almost got away with it, and of the incredible, almost magical, power of forensic science to uncover a truth that was hidden in plain sight. It is a story that proves that even the smallest of clues, a few strands of dog hair, shed in a moment of violence, can speak with a voice loud enough to be heard across the years, a voice that can, and did, bring a cold-blooded killer to justice. The lady in the lagoon was finally at peace, her story told, her killer held accountable, her memory a lasting testament to the relentless, and ultimately triumphant, pursuit of the truth. Story 6. The city of New Orleans wears its ghosts like a shroud. They linger in the humid air, thick with the scent of magnolias and decay. They whisper from the ornate ironwork of the French Quarter balconies and dance in the flickering gas lamps that cast long, skeletal shadows on the cobblestone streets. It is a city that breathes history, a place where joy and sorrow are 2 sides of the same tarnished coin, where life is lived with a feverish intensity, as if every moment might be the last. In the summer of 2005, a new and terrible ghost was born. Hurricane Katrina did not just break the levees, it broke the city's heart. It left behind a landscape of apocalyptic devastation, a waterlogged world of splintered homes and silent streets. Yet, in the heart of the storm's wreckage, in the eerily quiet and abandoned French Quarter, a strange and defiant kind of life flickered. For a few who chose to stay, the disaster became a crucible, forging a new reality in the crucible of shared survival. Among them were Zachary Bowen and Addie Hall, 2 souls who found in the chaos a temporary paradise, a love story written in the eye of the storm. Theirs would become one of New Orleans' most infamous tales, a southern fried romance that began in the defiant spirit of survival and ended in an act of unimaginable horror. Zach Bowen was a man of contradictions. Born in California, he possessed the easy charm and laid-back attitude of a sun-bleached beachcomber. He was strikingly handsome, with long blonde hair and a charismatic smile that could disarm strangers and win hearts. But beneath the surface, he was a man haunted by demons he could neither name nor escape. He had married young, to a woman named Lana, and had 2 children. To support his family, he joined the Army in May 2000, seeking the structure and benefits it offered. His military career took him to the war-torn landscapes of Kosovo and Iraq, where he served as a military policeman. He saw things that no person should have to see. He was traumatized by the sudden death of a fellow soldier and haunted by the memory of a young Iraqi child he had befriended, a child who was killed for the simple act of conversing with soldiers. The horrors of war burrowed deep into his psyche, leaving scars that were invisible but profound. He was decorated for his service, a war hero on paper, but he returned to civilian life a broken man, grappling with a severe case of post-traumatic stress disorder that went undiagnosed and untreated. The army had given him medals, but it had taken a part of his soul. His marriage crumbled, and he found himself adrift in New Orleans, working odd jobs in French Quarter bars, his past a constant, oppressive weight on his shoulders. Adrienne Addie Hall was a force of nature. A poet, an artist, and a dancer, she was a free spirit with a fiery temper and a fierce independence. She had come to New Orleans from the Northeast, seeking a place where her bohemian soul could thrive. She found it in the French Quarter, a place she embraced so fully that she called herself a Quarterican. She was a familiar sight, riding her bike through the narrow streets to her bartending job at the Spotted Cat, her presence a vibrant splash of color against the district's weathered patina. But Addie, too, was fighting her own battles. Her past was marked by abusive relationships that had left her wary of men. She suffered from bipolar disorder, a tempestuous internal sea that she navigated with the help of medication she often neglected to take, leading to unpredictable, angry outbursts. Her life was a delicate balancing act, a struggle to reconcile her artistic aspirations with the relentless grip of her inner demons and addictions. They met in the way so many in the Quarter do, across a bar. Both were bartending, moving through the nocturnal world of clinking glasses and easy conversation. Addie, guarded by her past, initially treated Zach with a playful cruelty, a test to see what he could handle. He was drawn to her feisty spirit, she to his quiet charm. A relationship bloomed, but it was tumultuous from the start, a volatile cocktail of genuine affection, explosive arguments, and a shared reliance on the numbing embrace of drugs and alcohol. They were two damaged people who found in each other a flawed reflection of themselves. When the warnings about Hurricane Katrina began to blare across the city, Zach had planned to evacuate. His ex-wife, Lana, had even offered to let Addie come with him. But Addie was fiercely independent. She refused to leave her apartment, her city. Zach went to check on her, intending to persuade her to go, but found he couldn't leave her side. They decided to ride out the storm together, a decision that would irrevocably bind their fates. As Katrina unleashed its fury, plunging the city into darkness and chaos, Zach and Addie found an unlikely sanctuary in her apartment. The storm stripped away the modern world, leaving behind a primal, almost romantic desolation. In the weeks that followed, the French Quarter became their private kingdom. They, along with a handful of other holdouts, became a small, self-sufficient tribe. They cooked meals over a bonfire in the middle of the street, drank warm booze from coolers, and sang songs under a night sky suddenly brilliant with stars, unobscured by the city's usual electric glow. They were the king and queen of the Quarter, their story of love amidst the ruins capturing the imagination of the national media. They were photographed for magazines and interviewed for newspapers, their faces becoming symbols of New Orleans' defiant resilience. They were swept up in the romance of it all, oblivious to the true horror unfolding just blocks away at the Superdome and in the flooded neighborhoods where thousands were suffering. For a brief, surreal period, they felt on top of the world, their love forged in the crucible of a shared apocalypse. But the apocalypse ended. The waters receded, the lights came back on, and the long, arduous process of rebuilding began. The return of normalcy was a harsh awakening for Zach and Addie. The bonfire was extinguished, bills piled up, and the responsibilities of their old lives came rushing back. The magic of their shared survival evaporated, leaving behind the stark reality of their dysfunctional relationship. The city's slow, painful recovery mirrored the decay of their love. Zach, already scarred by his experiences in Iraq, was deeply traumatized by the post-Katrina landscape. The sight of military vehicles patrolling the streets and the sheer scale of the destruction triggered his PTSD in a way he couldn't control. The natural high of their Katrina experience was gone, and they sought a new one in the familiar, destructive embrace of alcohol and drugs. Their fights grew more frequent and more violent, the physical and emotional abuse escalating. The dream was over. In a desperate attempt to rekindle the passion they had lost, they decided to start over. They found a new apartment for rent on Rampart Street, a historic Creole cottage with living quarters situated above the Voodoo Spiritual Temple, a well-known cultural landmark run by priestess Miriam Chamini. With the tips they had saved, they paid the deposit and moved in, hoping a change of scenery could mend their fractured bond. The hope was short-lived. Almost as soon as they unpacked, the final, fatal crack appeared. Addie, suspecting Zach was cheating on her, went to their landlord. In an act of ultimate betrayal, she asked that the lease be put in her name only, effectively giving her the power to evict him. The landlord, hoping they would work things out, simply wrote up a handwritten contract. But when Zach learned of her deception, something inside him snapped. The man who was already teetering on the edge of a psychological precipice was pushed over. The charm, the smile, the laid-back demeanor, it all fell away, revealing the rage and despair that had been festering beneath. The end came in the dead of night. Around 1 o'clock in the morning on Thursday, October 5th, 2006, in the small apartment above the Voodoo Temple, the arguments and the anger reached their horrifying conclusion. In a cold, calm rage, Zach Bowen strangled Addie Hall to death on their futon. It was, as he would later write, very quick. In a drunken, grief-stricken stupor, he fell asleep next to her lifeless body. The hurricane that had been raging inside him had finally made landfall, leaving behind a devastation more intimate and more terrible than any storm. The days that followed were a descent into a surreal, methodical madness. The world outside continued on, oblivious. Zach got up the next day and went to work. His co-workers noted a change in him. He was quiet, withdrawn, hiding behind sunglasses and a hat. When friends of Addie's called or ran into him, he told them a simple, plausible lie. She had left him and gone back to her family in North Carolina. Some were surprised, knowing how much she loved New Orleans, but others, aware of her unpredictable nature, accepted the story. No one could have fathomed the truth. Back at the apartment on Rampart Street, Zach began a gruesome task. He took Addie's body to the bathtub and, with a hacksaw and a knife, he began to dismember her. His stated intention: the act was a grotesque parody of domesticity, a nightmarish culinary project unfolding in the heart of the French Quarter. While initial reports fueled speculation of cannibalism, the autopsy later confirmed that no part of her had been consumed. For days, Zach lived in this house of horrors, a man existing in two separate realities: the mundane world of work and social interaction, and the secret, blood-soaked world of his apartment. The weight of his secret, however, was becoming unbearable. He spent the $1,500 cash he had on him, living out his final days in a blur of what he called good food, good drugs, good strippers, good friends. He was tying up the loose ends of a life he had decided to end. He was saying goodbye without saying a word. On the evening of Tuesday, October 17th, 2006, nearly 2 weeks after he had killed Addie, Zach Bowen climbed to the rooftop bar of the Omni Royal Orleans Hotel. He had a final drink, paced nervously for a moment, and then committed his last act of violence. He jumped. His body landed on the roof of a parking garage 7 stories below. Police who arrived at the scene found the 28-year-old's body. In his pocket, they discovered a folded, plastic-wrapped note. Inside the bag were also his military dog tags and a key. The note was addressed police only. It began with a chillingly direct confession. "This is not accidental. I had to take my own life to pay for the one I took. If you send a patrol car to 826 N Rampart, you will find the dismembered corpse of my girlfriend Addie in the fridge, and a full signed confession from myself. Zach Bowen." The note led detectives to the apartment above the Voodoo Temple. The first thing they noticed upon entering was the cold. The air conditioning was blasting, set to 60 degrees, a desperate and surprisingly effective attempt to mask the smell of death. The apartment was disheveled, filled with unopened moving boxes, a testament to a future that would never happen. Then they saw the walls. In silver spray paint, Zach had scrawled his final, haunting messages. "I love her," read one. "I'm a total failure," declared another. And then, the most horrifying directive, an arrow pointing toward the kitchen. What the seasoned detectives found next would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They opened the heavy refrigerator door. They found Addie Hall. The scene was exactly as Zach's note had described, a macabre and meticulously arranged tableau of death. In the apartment, they also found Addie's journal. Zach had used its final pages to write a more detailed account of his actions and his state of mind. His words revealed a man who was horrified not by the act of murder itself, but by his own chilling lack of remorse. "Today is Monday, October 16th, 2 a.m., he wrote. "I killed her at 1 a.m. Thursday, October 5th. I very calmly strangled her. It was very quick. I scared myself not by the action of calmly strangling the woman I've loved for 1.5 years, and then desecrating her body, but by my entire lack of remorse. I've known for forever how horrible of a person I am, ask anyone, and decided to quit my jobs and spend the 1,500 cash I had being happy until I killed myself. So that's what I did, and had a fantastic time living out my days. It's just about time now." The story of Zach and Addie became a sensation, a modern-day Southern Gothic horror story that captivated and repulsed the nation. It was a tale of love and death in a city synonymous with both. Some tried to find supernatural explanations, blaming the tragedy on the dark voodoo of the building they lived in, but the truth was far more terrestrial and far more tragic. It was a perfect storm of untreated mental illness, Zach's PTSD and Addie's bipolar disorder, exacerbated by substance abuse and the lingering trauma of a city shattered by a hurricane. Zach Bowen was not a monster born of voodoo curses. He was a casualty of a war he could not leave behind and a system that failed to help him. In his suicide note, he wrote that he had 28 cigarette burns on his body, one for each year of his life, to mark his failures in school, jobs, military, marriage, parenthood, morals, love. He was a man drowning in his own despair, and he pulled the woman he loved down with him. The story's darkness rippled outward in a final, grim twist. A close friend of the couple, Margaret Sanchez, who had mourned them on camera, would later be convicted in the 2012 death and dismemberment of Jaron Lockhart, a Bourbon Street dancer. The crime was eerily similar, another life cut short, another body dismembered. It was as if the violence that consumed Zach and Addie had become a contagion. Today, the apartment at 826 North Rampart Street is a stop on ghost tours, its gruesome history a commodity for tourists seeking a thrill. But the true horror of the story lies not in any haunting, but in the all-too-real tragedy of two vibrant, troubled lives destroyed by a hurricane they weathered together and the one that raged within. They were the king and queen of the quarter, a symbol of hope in a ruined city, but in the end, they could not survive themselves. Story 7. In the quiet, unassuming suburb of Deer Park, Texas, in the autumn of 1974, Ronald Clark O'Brien was the very picture of American respectability. At 30 years old, he was an optician, a deacon at his local Baptist church, the conductor of the church choir, and a devoted family man. He lived with his wife, Daneen, and their two beautiful children, 8-year-old Timothy and 5-year-old Elizabeth, in a modest home that was the embodiment of the suburban dream. To his neighbors and fellow churchgoers, Ronald O'Brien was a pillar of the community, a friendly, upstanding man who was always ready with a smile and a helping hand. But beneath this placid, carefully constructed facade, a different reality was festering. Ronald O'Brien was a man drowning in a sea of debt. He had held and lost 21 different jobs over the preceding decade, a pattern of instability that spoke to a deeper character flaw. By the fall of 1974, he was on the verge of financial ruin, owing more than $100,000, that is equivalent of over $500,000 today. He was about to lose his car, and foreclosure on his home was imminent. The pressure was immense, a vice that was squeezing the life out of his carefully maintained image. Ronald O'Brien was a desperate man, and desperate men, he was about to prove, are capable of the most monstrous of acts. In the months leading up to Halloween, a strange and sinister new interest had taken root in O'Brien's mind: cyanide. He began to ask questions, casual at first, then more persistent. He asked a chemist friend about the poison, how much it would take to kill someone. He approached a chemical supply salesman, inquiring about where he could purchase it. At the community college where he was taking classes, he peppered his professor with questions about the relative lethality of different poisons. He even tried to buy cyanide from 2 different chemical supply stores, leaving empty-handed only because the smallest amount available was more than he could afford or more than he needed. At the same time, O'Brien was quietly, methodically taking out life insurance policies on his children. In January, he had insured Timothy and Elizabeth for $10,000 each. Then, just a month before Halloween, he took out additional $20,000 policies on both of them. To his wife, Danine, he mentioned none of this. A plan was forming in the dark, secret corners of his mind, a monstrous solution to his financial woes. He was preparing to make a sacrifice, not on the altar of his faith, but on the altar of greed. Halloween night, 1974, fell on a Thursday. The air in Deer Park was warm and thick with the scent of burning leaves and the excited chatter of children. Ronald O'Brien, dressed in his everyday clothes, took Timothy and Elizabeth trick-or-treating. They were joined by a neighbor, Jim Bates, and his 2 children, Mark and Kimberly. The small group made their way through the familiar, decorated streets of their neighborhood, their plastic pumpkins and pillowcases slowly filling with candy. As the evening wore on, the group approached a house on a corner. The lights were out, the porch dark and unwelcoming. Jim Bates and the children, seeing no sign of life, moved on down the street. But Ronald O'Brien lingered behind in the shadows. A few minutes later, he caught up with the group, his arms laden with a strange prize. 5 giant, 22-inch pixie sticks, the powdered candy packaged in long plastic straws. He told the group that the residents of the dark house had cracked the door and showered him with candy. It was an odd story, but in the happy chaos of a Halloween night, no one gave it a second thought. He handed 1 pixie sticks to Timothy, 1 to Elizabeth, 1 to Mark, 1 to Kimberly, and the 5th to a 10-year-old boy he recognized from his church, Whitney Parker, who had joined the group a few houses back. Later that night, back at the O'Brien home, Timothy, tired from the excitement of the evening, was getting ready for bed. He asked if he could have 1 piece of candy before he went to sleep. Ronald, standing nearby, steered him towards the giant pixie sticks. It was the only treat he would have that night. Timothy perched on the edge of his bed, tore open the top of the plastic straw, and poured the sweet, colored powder into his mouth. Almost immediately, he complained that the candy tasted bitter. Ronald brought him a glass of Kool-Aid to wash the taste away. A moment later, Timothy staggered to the bathroom. He began to vomit violently, his small body convulsing in agonizing pain. By the time the ambulance arrived, it was too late. Timothy O'Brien was pronounced dead on arrival at the local hospital, less than an hour after he had eaten the Halloween candy. The dream of a quiet suburban life had just been shattered by an unimaginable nightmare. The news of Timothy O'Brien's death sent a wave of panic through the quiet community of Deer Park. A child had been poisoned by Halloween candy. It was the realization of a dark urban legend, a parent's worst nightmare made real. The police were immediately alerted to the existence of the other 4 giant pixie sticks that had been handed out by Ronald O'Brien. A frantic, late-night search began. The first call went to the Bates home. Jim Bates, woken by the police, found the 2 pixie sticks his children had received. They were still unopened. The next call went to the home of 10-year-old Whitney Parker. His parents found him in his bed, asleep, the pixie sticks in his hand. He had been trying to open it, but the staples that sealed the top of the plastic straw were too strong for his small fingers. He had given up and fallen asleep. That small, frustrating detail had saved his life. The final pixie sticks was in the O'Brien home, the one that had been intended for 5-year-old Elizabeth. She had not eaten it. All 4 of the remaining straws were rushed to a lab for analysis. The results were chilling. The top 2 inches of each straw had been filled not with candy, but with potassium cyanide, a dose large enough to kill 2 adults in each straw. The powdered candy had been carefully packed on top of the poison, and the plastic straws had been resealed with a staple. This was not an accident. This was a deliberate, calculated act of murder. The police investigation began with a single burning question. Who was the mad poisoner, the faceless monster who had handed out death from a darkened house? The entire community was gripped by fear. Parents across the Houston area were ordered to turn in all the candy their children had collected, a massive, unprecedented recall fueled by a citywide panic. The police were under immense pressure to find the killer. Their focus immediately turned to the man who had distributed the candy, Ronald O'Brien. He was the only person who had seen the mysterious resident of the dark house. The investigation, led by Pasadena Police Detective Mike Hinton, hinged on O'Brien's story. They asked him to retrace his steps, to take them to the house where he had received the poisoned candy. For days, O'Brien seemed to have a convenient and frustrating lapse of memory. He couldn't remember which house it was. Finally, after being pressed by the detectives, his memory was jogged. He pointed to a house on the corner, the home of a man named Courtney Melvin, an air traffic controller at Houston's Hobby Airport. The police, believing they had their man, descended on the airport and arrested Melvin in front of his colleagues. The mystery, it seemed, was solved. But it wasn't. Courtney Melvin had a rock-solid alibi. On Halloween night, he had been at work until 11 p.m. Dozens of colleagues and official timesheets confirmed his story. His wife and daughter had been home, but they had turned out the lights early because they had run out of candy. They had not opened the door to anyone. Ronald O'Brien's story was a lie. The realization sent a chill down the spine of the investigators. The only person who could have put the poison in the candy was the man who had handed it out. The focus of the investigation shifted, with a sickening certainty, to the grieving father himself. As the investigators began to dig into Ronald O'Brien's life, the carefully constructed facade of the respectable family man began to crumble. They learned of his crushing debt, the 21 failed jobs, the imminent repossession of his car, and then they discovered the life insurance policies. A call to the insurance company revealed a chilling fact. At 9 a.m. on the morning after his son's death, before the autopsy had even been performed, Ronald O'Brien had called to inquire about collecting on Timothy's policy. The pieces of a horrifying puzzle were beginning to fall into place. On November 5, 1974, just 5 days after Timothy's death, armed with a search warrant, detectives descended on the O'Brien home. They found a pair of scissors with a residue of plastic on the blades, consistent with the material of the pixie stick straws. In a drawer, they found a slip of paper, an adding machine tape on which O'Brien had meticulously tallied his debts. The total came to almost the exact amount of the insurance policies he stood to collect on the lives of his children. The evidence was circumstantial, but it painted a damning picture. They had the motive, greed. They had the means, access to cyanide, a fact later confirmed by the testimony of his professor and a chemical salesman. And they had the opportunity. He was the only person who had handled the candy before it was distributed. That same day, Ronald Clark O'Brien was arrested and charged with 1 count of capital murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. The mad poisoner of the urban legends was not a faceless stranger. He was a father. The trial of Ronald Clark O'Brien, which began in Houston on May 5, 1975, was a national media sensation. The press dubbed him the Candyman, a chilling moniker that would forever be associated with his terrible crime. O'Brien, who hired a legendary defense attorney, Marvin Teague, maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings. His defense was built on the very urban legend his crime had brought to terrifying life. The idea of a random, anonymous monster who poisoned Halloween candy. But the prosecution, led by the charismatic Vic Driscoll, methodically dismantled his defense. They presented the jury with the mountain of circumstantial evidence: the debt, the insurance policies, the inquiries about cyanide, the lie about the house on the corner. Friends and coworkers testified about O'Brien's unusual interest in cyanide in the months leading up to the murder. The most powerful testimony came from his own wife, Daneen. Looking pale and emotionless, she took the stand and told the court that she had been unaware of the life insurance policies her husband had taken out on their children. She recounted his strange lack of emotion after Timothy's death, how he had pounded on the wall and asked why an 8-year-old had to die, but how she had not seen a single tear in his eyes. She also refuted a key detail of his story, stating that it was Ronald who had pushed the pixie sticks on Timothy, not the other way around. The prosecution's closing argument was a masterpiece of righteous fury. Vic Driscoll, pointing at the defendant, declared, "His whole life has been a lie. He has used his church. He has used his friends. He has used his community and his family. And worst of all, he has used his son. Not as Abraham did. He sacrificed his son on the altar of greed." On June 3, 1975, after a trial that had gripped the nation, the jury retired to deliberate. They returned in just 46 minutes. The verdict was guilty on all counts. A little over an hour later, they delivered the sentence, death by lethal injection. Shortly after the conviction, Daneen O'Brien filed for divorce. She would later remarry, and her new husband adopted her daughter, Elizabeth, giving her a new name and a chance at a new life, free from the shadow of the father who had tried to kill her. Ronald O'Brien was sent to death row, where he would spend the next 9 years appealing his sentence. On the night of his execution, March 31, 1984, a large, angry crowd gathered outside the prison walls in Huntsville, Texas. They shouted "Trick or treat," and showered the building with candy, a final, bitter condemnation of the man who had perverted a cherished childhood tradition. Inside, O'Brien's final statement was one of defiant, misplaced piety. "What is about to transpire in a few moments is wrong," he said. "However, we as human beings have to be accountable for our actions. I will be forgiven for this." His final words were a request for God's forgiveness for all of us. He was pronounced dead at 12:48 a.m. The crime of Ronald Clark O'Brien did more than just take the life of his own son. It poisoned a culture. He gave a terrifying, real-life face to a long-standing urban legend, and in doing so, he changed the way a generation of parents looked at Halloween. The open, trusting tradition of trick-or-treating was forever altered, replaced by a new reality of X-rayed candy, trunk or treat, events in church parking lots, and a lingering background radiation of fear. The Candyman was gone, but the ghost of his crime would haunt the holiday for decades to come, a chilling reminder of the day a father's greed turned a child's sweet treat into a deadly instrument of murder. Story 8. The humid night air of Roppongi hung thick and heavy, a soupy mixture of neon, expensive perfume, and the faint, ever-present scent of stale cigarette smoke. It was a district that never truly slept, a labyrinth of concrete and glass, where desires were bought and sold under the watchful gaze of 1,000 blinking lights. Here, in the pulsating heart of Tokyo's nightlife, fortunes were made and lost, secrets were whispered in darkened booths, and violence, when it came, was swift and brutal. On the night of September 2nd, 2012, the usual rhythm of the city played out. Salarymen, their ties loosened and their inhibitions shed, stumbled from one brightly lit bar to the next. Young women in precariously high heels laughed as they navigated the crowded streets, their faces illuminated by the glow of their smartphones. And in the shadows, another world operated, one governed by its own set of rules, its own brutal code of honor. This was the world of the Bosozoku, the motorcycle gangs that had terrorized Japan's highways for decades, and their more sophisticated, more dangerous descendants. At the apex of this subterranean society was a man known as the Prince of Cruelty. His real name was Shinichi Maitate, but few dared to speak it aloud. He was the leader of Kanto Rengo, a gang that had evolved from a loose coalition of suburban motorcycle hooligans into a formidable criminal enterprise. Maitate was not your typical gangster. He was well built but not imposing, standing at a mere 167 centimeters. His face, which would later be plastered on wanted posters across the country, was unremarkable at first glance. But his eyes, dark and intense, held a chilling emptiness that spoke of a capacity for extreme violence. Maitate's reputation preceded him. He was known for his lavish lifestyle, complete with a luxury apartment that he shared with his German wife and their daughter. But beneath the veneer of sophistication lay a savage cruelty. He was infamous for beating his enemies to the brink of death, a sadistic streak that had earned him his moniker. Under his leadership, Kanto Rengo had become a force to be reckoned with, their influence stretching from the dimly lit karaoke bars of Shinjuku to the exclusive nightclubs of Roppongi. That night, a rumor had reached Maitate, a whisper carried on the wind that one of his rivals, a member of the despised Kimura Kai, was partying in Roppongi. The Kimura brothers, Kojiro and Tario, were gangsters with whom Kanto Rengo had a long and bloody history. The mere mention of their name was enough to set Maitate's blood boiling. Revenge, in his world, was not a dish best served cold. It was a fiery, all-consuming passion that demanded immediate satisfaction. The target was said to be at Studio Flower, a popular nightclub in the Roppongi 5-Chome district. The club was a multi-level maze of dance floors, VIP rooms, and shadowy corners, the perfect place for a man to lose himself in the hedonistic embrace of the night. It was also the perfect place for an ambush. Maitate assembled his crew, a group of 11 of his most trusted henchmen. They were a motley collection of thugs and enforcers, their loyalty to Maitate absolute. They gathered their weapons of choice, metal baseball bats, cold and heavy in their hands. They donned black ski masks, transforming themselves into a faceless, menacing force. The plan was simple: storm the club, find the Kimura brother, and beat him to death in front of his friends. It was a message, a brutal declaration of Kanto Rengo's dominance. The city, oblivious to the storm that was about to break, continued its nightly revelry. Inside Studio Flower, the music pounded, a relentless beat that vibrated through the floor and into the bones of the dancers. In the exclusive VIP area, a group of friends celebrated, their laughter and conversation lost in the cacophony of the club. Among them was Ryosuke Fujimoto, a 31-year-old restaurant manager. He was a man with a bright future, a man with no connection to the criminal underworld, a man who, in a tragic twist of fate, bore a striking resemblance to one of the Kimura brothers. At precisely 3:43 a.m., the doors of Studio Flower burst open. The sudden intrusion of the cold night air and the sight of a dozen masked men armed with baseball bats sent a wave of panic through the club. The music screeched to a halt, replaced by the screams of the partygoers. The once joyful atmosphere was shattered, replaced by a primal fear. The masked figures moved with a terrifying efficiency, their eyes scanning the VIP area. They spotted Fujimoto, sitting with his friends, and in that moment, his fate was sealed. The resemblance was close enough. In the dim, flashing lights of the club, in the adrenaline-fueled haze of the moment, he was the man they were looking for. The attack was a blur of motion and violence. The henchmen descended upon Fujimoto, their bats swinging with brutal force. His friends watched in horror, powerless to intervene. The sound of metal hitting flesh and bone echoed through the now silent club, a sickening percussion that would haunt the witnesses for the rest of their lives. The assault was relentless, a frenzied explosion of rage that left no room for mercy. When it was over, Fujimoto lay motionless on the floor, his body broken and battered. The masked figures, their grim work done, melted back into the night, leaving a scene of carnage and a lifetime of trauma in their wake. The aftermath was a chaotic tableau of flashing lights, frantic paramedics, and stunned, weeping witnesses. The police arrived to find a scene of unimaginable brutality. The VIP area, once a haven of exclusivity and pleasure, had been transformed into a slaughterhouse. Fujimoto was rushed to the hospital, but it was too late. He was pronounced dead, the victim of a savage beating that had been as senseless as it was brutal. As the initial shock began to subside, the investigation began. The police quickly pieced together the events of the night, their focus narrowing in on Kanto Rengo and its charismatic, psychopathic leader. Maitate's name was on everyone's lips, his reputation for violence making him the prime suspect. The motive, it seemed, was clear: a classic gangland dispute, a turf war played out with baseball bats in the heart of Tokyo. But as the investigators dug deeper, a horrifying truth began to emerge. Ryosuke Fujimoto was not a gangster. He had no ties to the Kimura Kai, no involvement in the criminal underworld. He was an innocent man, a hard-working restaurant manager who had been in the wrong place at the wrong time, a man who had paid the ultimate price for the sin of looking like someone else. The realization sent a new wave of shock and outrage through the city. This was no longer a simple case of gangsters killing gangsters. This was the murder of an innocent civilian, a random act of violence that shattered the illusion of safety that so many Tokyoites held dear. The media seized on the story, the tragic irony of Fujimoto's death a powerful and compelling narrative. He became a symbol of the senselessness of gang violence, his face, smiling and full of life in the photos released by his grieving family, a stark contrast to the brutal reality of his death. The pressure on the police to solve the case was immense. The public demanded justice, the media clamored for answers, and the government, eager to quell the growing sense of unease, made it clear that the perpetrators would be brought to book. The hunt for Shinichi Maitate and his accomplices was on. But Maitate was no fool. He knew that the authorities would be coming for him, that the full weight of the Japanese justice system was about to descend upon him. He was a phantom, a ghost in the machine, and he had no intention of being caught. While his henchmen were being rounded up one by one, Maitate made his escape. A week after the murder, on September 9, 2012, he boarded a flight to Beijing, the first step in a desperate journey to evade justice. From China, he flew to Seoul, South Korea, his movements a carefully calculated dance to throw the police off his scent. 2 months later, in early November, he surfaced in Jakarta, Indonesia, before finally arriving in the Philippines. The Philippines, with its sprawling archipelagos, its teeming cities, and its notoriously porous borders, was the perfect place for a man like Maitate to disappear. He vanished into the labyrinthine streets of Manila, a ghost in a city of millions. The trail went cold. Back in Japan, the investigation continued, but the absence of the ringleader cast a long shadow over the proceedings. Maitate's accomplices were arrested and put on trial, their testimony painting a chilling picture of the inner workings of Kanto Rengo and the absolute power that Maitate held over his followers. But without the man who had ordered the attack, justice felt incomplete. The Japanese authorities, in cooperation with Interpol, issued a red notice for Maitate's arrest, his face now joining the ranks of the world's most wanted criminals. A reward of up to 3 million yen was offered for information leading to his capture, a desperate attempt to entice someone, anyone, to break the code of silence that protected him. Years passed. The seasons changed, the neon lights of Roppongi continued to flash, and the memory of Ryosuke Fujimoto's murder began to fade from the public consciousness. But for the police, and for Fujimoto's family, the case remained an open wound. The thought of Maitate living freely, enjoying a life that he had so brutally stolen from another man, was a bitter pill to swallow. The investigation in the Philippines was a frustrating exercise in futility. Leads would surface, whispers of a Japanese fugitive living in a condominium in Manila's Malate district, a man with a new face, courtesy of a plastic surgeon's knife. The Philippine authorities would raid the location, their hopes high, only to come up empty-handed. The fugitive was always one step ahead, a ghost who left no trace. There were rumors that Maitate had found a safe haven on the island of Cebu, its lush jungles and remote villages providing the perfect cover for a man on the run. But these, too, proved to be dead ends. The information was a confusing mix of fact and fiction, of genuine sightings and deliberately planted misinformation. Maitate, it seemed, had powerful friends, people who were willing to protect him, to hide him from the prying eyes of the law. As the years turned into a decade, the case grew cold. The wanted posters, once a ubiquitous sight in police stations and public buildings across Japan, began to fade, their corners curling with age. The reward money remained unclaimed. Maitate had become a ghost, a phantom who haunted the fringes of the criminal underworld, his name a byword for a crime that had shocked a nation and a justice that had been denied. In an effort to reignite public interest and generate new leads, the Tokyo Metropolitan Police Department released new, digitally altered sketches of Maitate in 2024, imagining what he might look like after more than a decade on the run. The images, showing a man who was fatter, thinner, older, were a poignant reminder of the passage of time, of the years that Maitate had stolen from his victim and from the cause of justice. The release of the sketches did generate a flurry of new tips, over 1,000 in total, but each one led to a dead end. The man in the photos was always someone else, a case of mistaken identity that echoed the tragic irony of Fujimoto's death. The case of Shinichi Maitate is a story of a man who lived by the sword and who, so far, has managed to avoid perishing by it. It is a story of a culture of violence that lurks beneath the surface of one of the world's most orderly societies. And it is a story of a family's unending grief, of their quest for a justice that remains tantalizingly out of reach. Somewhere in the world, perhaps in the bustling streets of Manila, perhaps in a remote village in the Philippine countryside, Shinichi Maitate is still out there. He is a man without a country, a man without a name, a ghost who is forever looking over his shoulder. The Prince of Cruelty may have escaped his kingdom, but he can never escape the shadow of his crime. The ghost of Roppongi still walks, and the hunt for him continues. Story 9. In the spring of 1982, the world of 16-year-old Kimberly Kim, Louiselle was a small, familiar landscape of high school hallways, whispered secrets with her sisters, and the budding romance of a first love. She lived in South Leon, Michigan, a quiet corner of the state where life moved with the gentle, predictable rhythm of the changing seasons. Kim was a girl with a poet's heart, her notebooks filled with verses that tried to capture the fleeting, intense emotions of adolescence. She was, by all accounts, a typical teenager, standing on the bright, hopeful precipice of her own life. Saturday, March 20th, 1982, was a day that began in the ordinary comfort of that life. Kim had spent the day with her boyfriend. As evening began to fall, she started the journey home, a trip she had made many times before. In the casual, less cautious world of the early 1980s, hitchhiking was a common, accepted way for teenagers to get around, a means of navigating the sprawling geography of suburban and rural Michigan. Kim, like so many of her peers, often relied on the kindness of strangers to get where she needed to go. Her journey began at the intersection of 8 Mile and Inkster Roads, a busy crossroads that was the first leg of her trip. She caught a ride that took her further east, to the corner of 8 Mile and Merriman Roads in Livonia. It was now around 6:30 p.m., the sky beginning to bruise with the colors of sunset. She was still miles from home, and the last, crucial leg of her journey lay before her. From a gas station payphone, she called her mother, Joanna, her voice a familiar, reassuring sound, telling her she was on her way home. She then made a series of at least 4 more calls, reaching out to friends in South Lyon, trying to arrange for a ride for the final stretch of her journey. Each call was a small, hopeful cast into the evening, a search for a friendly face to bring her home. But no ride materialized. The friends she called were unavailable, their plans already set for a Saturday night. Her options exhausted, Kim stepped away from the relative safety of the payphone and back to the side of the road, her thumb outstretched, her face turned towards the oncoming headlights of strangers. It was the last time she was ever seen alive. As the night deepened and the stream of headlights dwindled, Kim Louiselle vanished, swallowed by the cold, indifferent darkness of a Michigan highway. The silence that fell after Kim's last phone call was, at first, an ordinary one. But as the hours stretched on, and the clock ticked past the time she should have been home, that silence began to take on a sinister weight. Her mother, Joanna, sat by the phone, a knot of worry tightening in her stomach. By the next morning, Sunday, March 21st, the worry had blossomed into a full-blown, terrifying panic. Kim was gone. The family's world was upended. They began the frantic, heartbreaking work of trying to trace a ghost. They called her friends, her boyfriend, anyone and everyone who might have seen her, who might know where she was. But every call led to a dead end. No one had seen her since she had stood at the side of Merriman Road, a solitary figure hoping for a ride. That same day, they went to the Green Oak Township Police Department and filed a missing person report. But their pleas for help were met with a frustrating, almost dismissive calm. The police, hardened by the realities of dealing with the often chaotic lives of teenagers, saw a different narrative. A 16-year-old girl who hadn't come home on a Saturday night. To them, the most likely explanation was the simplest one. She was a runaway. It was a theory her mother, Joanna, rejected with every fiber of her being. She was not a runaway, she was on her way home. She said she was on her way home, she would later recall, her voice still raw with the memory of that terrible, frustrating day. But the police held to their theory, and the investigation in those first crucial days lacked the urgency that a potential abduction demanded. The days turned into weeks. The family, left to their own devices, continued their desperate search. They plastered the town with flyers bearing Kim's smiling face. They tracked down her friends, retracing her steps, searching for any clue, any whisper of information that might lead them to her. But there was nothing. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. Then on April 14, 1982, nearly a month after she had vanished, the agonizing wait came to a horrific end. Kim's body was found. She was discovered in a wooded, secluded area behind a park and ride in the Island Lake Recreation Area, a place of natural beauty that had been twisted into a scene of unimaginable horror. It was just 5 miles from the safety of her own home. The scene that confronted the investigators was one of shocking, savage brutality. Kim was found nude, her personal belongings gone. She had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and strangled. But it was the finding of the autopsy that added a new, even more chilling layer to the horror. The medical examiner determined that, despite having been missing for more than 3 weeks, Kim had only been dead for 4 to 5 days. The implication was staggering. She had not been killed on the night she was taken. She had been held captive, a prisoner of her abductor for weeks. Kim had been repeatedly raped, beaten, and strangled over a period of unimaginable terror. The initial theory of a teenage runaway had been replaced by the brutal reality of a kidnapping, a prolonged period of torture, and a murder. The police now had a homicide on their hands, a case with no witnesses, no suspects, and a killer who had vanished as completely as Kim herself had on that cold March night. The trail was ice cold before it had even begun. The ghost of Island Lake had claimed its first victim, but it would not be its last. For 40 years, the case of Kimberly Louiselle was a ghost story, a cold, silent file in the archives of the Michigan State Police. The initial investigation had yielded no substantial leads, no suspects, no justice. The world moved on. Kim's friends grew up, her sisters built lives of their own, but for her family, the wound never healed. The not knowing was a constant, dull ache, a question mark that hung over their lives, casting a long and terrible shadow. But one person refused to let the silence win. Kim's younger sister, Cindy Arthurs, made it her life's mission to find her sister's killer. As the years passed and the official investigation stalled, Cindy became a detective in her own right, a relentless seeker of a truth that seemed determined to stay buried. About 15 years after the murder, she began her quest in earnest, Googling her sister's name, only to find a few old, inaccurate articles. It was like she just didn't exist, Cindy recalled, the frustration still evident in her voice. So, that was where I started because I wanted to correct the wrong information, and then it just went from there. She started a Facebook page, a digital hub for information, a place to share memories, and a beacon of hope in the long, dark night of the cold case. She tracked down her sister's old friends, piecing together a more complete picture of Kim's life, her world, her last days. She was a constant, unwavering presence, a voice for the sister who had been silenced, a thorn in the side of a system that had, for too long, let the case lie dormant. Then, in the summer of 2022, a new set of eyes fell upon the dusty case files. As part of a unique and innovative program, the Michigan State Police Cold Case Unit partnered with students from Michigan State University's School of Criminal Justice. These students, young, bright, and armed with a fresh perspective, were given the monumental task of sifting through the boxes of old evidence, the yellowing reports, the faded photographs of a crime that had been committed before many of them were even born. As they delved into the files, a name caught their attention, a name that had been buried in the archives for decades. It was from an old tip from back in 1983. A person had called the police to report their suspicions about a man named Charles David Shaw. The tipster said that Shaw had lived in the same area as Kim, and that he had recently destroyed his apartment, an act they found deeply suspicious. The police at the time had made a note of it, but for reasons lost to the fog of time, they had never tracked Shaw down. To the MSU students, this was more than just a forgotten lead. It was a thread, and they were determined to pull on it. At the very same time, just a few miles away, another cold case team was pulling on a thread of their own, a thread that was about to intersect with the Louiselle case in a way no one could have predicted. The Livingston County Sheriff's Office Cold Case Unit was re-examining the 1983 murder of another young woman, 19-year-old Christina Castiglione. Christina had disappeared on March 19, 1983, almost exactly a year after Kim Louiselle was abducted. Like Kim, she had been walking along a road in Redford Township when she vanished. Her body was found 10 days later in a state game area. She too had been strangled and sexually assaulted. During her autopsy, investigators had collected DNA evidence, but in the pre-DNA era, it was a clue without a key. The sample was preserved, entered into the National Codes database in the early 2000s, but it had never matched anyone. In March of 2022, the Livingston County investigators received a grant from Season of Justice, a non-profit organization that provides funding for advanced DNA testing in cold cases. They sent the DNA evidence from Christina's body to Othram, a private lab in Texas that specializes in forensic genealogy. Using cutting-edge techniques, the scientists at Othram were able to build a genealogical profile from the decades-old DNA. They uploaded the profile to public genealogy databases and began the painstaking work of building a family tree, searching for the unknown killer's relatives. The investigation led them to the family of Charles David Shaw. With the cooperation of his family, who provided their own DNA for comparison, the investigators were able to confirm, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Charles David Shaw was the man who had killed Christina Castiglione. The ghost had a name. The news was a major breakthrough, a 40-year-old mystery finally solved. But the story didn't end there. When the MSU students working on the Kim Louiselle case heard the name Charles David Shaw, a jolt went through their investigation. It was the same name from the forgotten 1983 tip. The two separate, parallel investigations had converged on a single, terrifying point. The focus on Shaw as the suspect in Kim Louiselle's murder intensified. Investigators began to map his life, the places he lived, the places he worked. They discovered that his known locations formed a chilling geography that surrounded the area where Kim had been taken and where her body had been found. With this new, powerful lead, the investigators went back to the evidence from Kim's case, the boxes that had been sitting in storage for 4 decades. The MSU students and the detectives conducted a full audit, and they sent the evidence back to the Michigan State Police Crime Lab for retesting, using modern techniques that were unimaginable in 1982. They were hoping for a miracle, for a single, microscopic clue that had been missed. For months later, they got it. In the midst of the decades-old evidence, a single sperm cell was found. It was a 1-in-a-million shot, a biological needle in a haystack of time. The DNA from that single cell was extracted and uploaded into the system. It was a perfect match to the DNA of Charles David Shaw. After 41 years of silence, of dead ends, of agonizing uncertainty, the truth was finally known. Charles David Shaw was the man who had abducted, held captive, and murdered 16-year-old Kimberly Louiselle. The police were now 100% confident that they had their man. But the resolution of the case was a bittersweet one, a victory for science and persistence that was hollowed out by the passage of time. Charles David Shaw would never face a jury for his crimes. He would never be held accountable in a court of law. On November 27, 1983, just months after he had murdered Christina Castiglione, he was found dead in his Detroit apartment. His death was ruled an accident, the result of autoerotic asphyxiation. The monster had died, not by the hand of justice, but by his own hand, in the midst of a sordid, solitary act. The identification of Charles David Shaw as a double murderer has led investigators to believe that he may have been a serial killer, that there may be other victims, other cold cases that bear his dark signature. They are now re-examining unsolved crimes from the early 1970s until his death in 1983, searching for his ghost and other forgotten files. For the family of Kimberly Louisel, the news brought a complex and profound sense of closure. The question of who had been answered. The man who had stolen their daughter, their sister, their friend, finally had a name and a face. But it was a justice stripped of its final, satisfying act. "It's a name," Cindy Arthurs said, her words a testament to the long, hard road she had traveled. "And that's more than we had yesterday." The case of Kimberly Louisel is a story of a darkness that hid in plain sight, of a killer who moved through the world unnoticed, leaving a trail of devastation in his wake. But it is also a story of a light that refused to be extinguished. It is the story of a sister's unwavering love, of a group of dedicated students who breathed new life into a forgotten case, and of the incredible power of science to reach back across the decades and pull a name from the silence. The ghost of Island Lake has finally been identified, but the memory of the two young women, whose lives he so brutally stole, will forever be a part of the landscape of Michigan, a tragic and enduring reminder of the long, slow, but ultimately relentless arc of justice. Story 10. In the rarefied, sun-drenched air of Beverly Hills, California, the name Menendez, in the summer of 1989, was synonymous with the glittering, ruthless promise of the American dream. The family resided in a sprawling, Spanish-style mansion on Elm Drive, a street of palm trees and quiet opulence, a world away from the grit and hustle of ordinary life. At the head of this kingdom was Jose Menendez, a 45-year-old Cuban immigrant who had clawed his way from poverty to the pinnacle of corporate success. He was a self-made man, a driven, demanding, and often brutal executive at Live Entertainment, a home video distribution company. His wife, Mary Louise, known to everyone as Kitty, was a former beauty queen, a fragile, often unhappy woman who had submerged her own ambitions in the service of her husband's relentless climb. Their two sons, Joseph Lyle, 21, and Eric Galen, 18, were the heirs apparent to this gilded empire. They were handsome, privileged young men who had been given every advantage: expensive schools, private tennis lessons, and the assumption of a future paved with gold. Lyle was the older, more confident brother, a student at Princeton University. Eric was the younger, more sensitive and introspective of the two, a gifted tennis player with aspirations of going pro. To the outside world, they were the very picture of a perfect, powerful family, the living embodiment of Jose's hard-won success. But behind the manicured hedges and locked gates of the Elm Drive mansion, a different reality was festering. The house was not a home. It was a pressure cooker of impossibly high expectations, emotional distance, and a dark, corrosive secret. Jose was a tyrant, a father who ruled his sons with an iron fist, his love conditional, his approval a prize that was always just out of reach. Kitty, trapped in a difficult marriage and prone to bouts of depression, was often a distant and ineffective buffer between her husband's domineering nature and her son's growing resentment. The perfect family was a perfect fiction, a carefully constructed facade that was about to be shattered in a hailstorm of shotgun pellets and a torrent of blood. On a warm August night, the pressure that had been building for years would finally, catastrophically explode. Sunday, August 20th, 1989, was a quiet evening on Elm Drive. Jose and Kitty Menendez were settled in for the night, watching television in the den of their mansion, a bowl of ice cream and strawberries between them. Outside, the night was still and warm. At 11:47 p.m., the calm was shattered by a frantic, hysterical 911 call. The voice on the line belonged to Lyle Menendez. He was screaming, sobbing, his words a choked, almost incomprehensible torrent of terror. "Somebody killed my parents," he cried. "My mom and dad are shot." The first officers to arrive on the scene were confronted with a tableau of almost unimaginable horror. The den, a room that should have been a place of comfort and family, had been transformed into a slaughterhouse. Jose Menendez lay on the floor, his body riddled with shotgun blasts, including a point-blank shot to the back of his head that had all but obliterated his face. Kitty Menendez was on the sofa, her body a bloody, mangled ruin, shot 10 times as she had apparently tried to crawl away from the initial fusillade. The room was awash in blood, the air thick with the metallic scent of death. It was an execution, a crime of such savage, unrestrained brutality that it spoke of a deep and personal hatred. Lyle and Eric, the two sons who had discovered the scene, were outside on the lawn, seemingly overcome with grief. They told the police a story of having gone to the movies and then to the Taste of L.A. food festival. They had returned home late, they said, to find the scene of carnage. They suggested that their father, a man with powerful enemies, had been the victim of a professional mob-style hit. In the initial hours of the investigation, the story seemed plausible. The Beverly Hills police, faced with a crime of such extreme violence, began to look into Jose's complex and often acrimonious business dealings. They investigated his former associates, the lawsuits, the rumors of organized crime connections. For a time, the brothers were treated not as suspects, but as the tragic, orphan survivors of a horrific crime. But as the days turned into weeks, the detectives began to notice something strange. The grief of the Menendez brothers seemed to be remarkably short-lived. In the months following the murders, Lyle and Eric embarked on an epic and ostentatious spending spree. They bought Rolex watches, designer clothes, and expensive cars, including a Porsche for Eric. Lyle purchased a restaurant in Princeton, New Jersey. They traveled, they partied, they lived the lives of two young men who had suddenly come into a vast, unearned fortune. Their spending, which totaled an estimated $700,000, was a red flag that was impossible to ignore. The investigators' suspicion deepened when they discovered that the brothers had hired a computer expert to erase a recently updated version of their father's will from his computer, a will from which they had been disinherited. The theory of a mob hit was beginning to look less and less likely. The focus of the investigation was turning, with a sickening certainty, towards the two sons who seemed to be celebrating their parents' deaths rather than mourning them. But suspicion was not proof. The investigators had no physical evidence, no witnesses, no murder weapon. The case was a frustrating dead end, a puzzle with a missing piece. That missing piece, they would soon discover, was buried in the confidential files of a Beverly Hills psychologist, a secret that was about to be brought into the light by a jealous, scorned lover. The break in the case came not from a piece of forensic evidence, but from the tortured conscience of the younger brother, Eric. In the months following the murders, his behavior had become increasingly erratic. The weight of his terrible secret was crushing him. In October of 1989, he walked into the office of his psychologist, Dr. Jerome Oziel, and confessed. In a series of tearful, tape-recorded sessions, he laid bare the truth. He and Lyle had planned and carried out the murder of their parents. Eric told Dr. Oziel that they had killed their father because he was too domineering, that they wanted to be free from his oppressive control. They had killed their mother, he said, because she was an unhappy, unstable alcoholic, and it was a mercy. The confession was a stunning, explosive revelation, a direct admission of guilt from one of the killers. But it was a confession that was protected by the sacrosanct confidentiality of the therapist-patient relationship. Dr. Oziel could not go to the police. But there was a third person in this psychodramatic triangle, Dr. Oziel's mistress, a woman named Judalon Smith. Dr. Oziel, in a move of stunningly poor professional and personal judgment, had allowed Smith to listen in on the taped confession sessions. She became the keeper of a secret she had no right to know, a secret that gave her a dangerous power over both Dr. Oziel and the Menendez brothers. When her own relationship with Dr. Oziel began to sour, she decided to use that power. In March of 1990, 7 months after the murders, Judalon Smith went to the Beverly Hills police and told them everything she had heard. Her story, and the existence of the tapes, was the break the investigators had been waiting for. Lyle was arrested shortly thereafter. Eric, who was in Israel for a tennis tournament, returned to the United States and turned himself in. The two brothers were charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, charges that made them eligible for the death penalty. The arrests marked the beginning of a long and complex legal battle over the admissibility of the confession tapes. The defense argued that the tapes were protected by therapist-patient privilege. The prosecution argued that the privilege was voided because Lyle had threatened Dr. Oziel, and because the confession had been made in the presence of a third party, Judalon Smith. After a series of appeals that went all the way to the California Supreme Court, a compromise was reached. Portions of the tapes, the court ruled, could be played for a jury. The stage was now set for a trial that would become one of the most sensational and divisive in American history. A trial that would expose the dark, rotten underbelly of a seemingly perfect family. The first Menendez brothers trial, which began in July of 1993, was a landmark moment in the history of American jurisprudence. It was one of the first trials to be broadcast gavel to gavel on the new cable channel, Court TV, turning a tragic family drama into a national soap opera. The trial was held in a single courtroom, but with 2 separate juries, one for each brother, a legal maneuver designed to navigate the complexities of their individual defenses. At the heart of the defense was a brilliant, fiery, and fiercely dedicated attorney named Leslie Abramson. She had a reputation as a bulldog, a tireless advocate for her clients, and in the Menendez case, she crafted a defense that was as revolutionary as it was controversial. She did not argue that her clients were innocent. Instead, she argued that they had killed their parents, but that they had done so in self-defense, an act of imperfect self-defense, born of years of horrific and sustained abuse. Eric and Lyle took the stand, and in tearful, often excruciating testimony, they painted a picture of a childhood that was a living hell. They described their father, Jose, not as a successful executive, but as a monstrous pedophile who had abused them both from a young age. They described their mother, Kitty, as a volatile, emotionally unstable alcoholic and drug abuser who was aware of the abuse but did nothing to stop it, a silent, complicit partner in her husband's crimes. The defense argued that on the night of the murders, the brothers had been driven by a genuine and immediate fear for their lives. They claimed that their father had threatened to kill them to prevent them from exposing his dark secret. The murders, Abramson argued, were not an act of greed, but a desperate, preemptive strike by 2 terrified young men who saw no other way out. This was not a murder case, she contended. It was a manslaughter case, a tragic, but legally justifiable homicide. The prosecution, led by Deputy District Attorney Pamela Bozanic, presented a starkly different narrative. They argued that the claims of abuse were a recent, cynical fabrication, a desperate, last-ditch attempt to justify an unjustifiable crime. They pointed to the fact that the abuse allegations had never been mentioned until after the brothers were arrested and facing the death penalty. They presented witnesses, friends and family members, who testified that they had never seen any sign of abuse, that the Menendez family, from the outside, had appeared to be a happy, successful, and loving one. The prosecution focused on the motive of greed. They detailed the brothers' lavish spending spree in the months after the murders, painting a picture of 2 cold-blooded killers who were celebrating their newfound freedom and wealth. And they focused on the sheer, unmitigated brutality of the crime itself. The number of shotgun blasts, the point-blank shot to Jose's head. This was not the work of 2 terrified boys acting in self-defense, they argued. This was the work of 2 men consumed by a deep and abiding hatred, a hatred that had culminated in an act of almost unimaginable violence. After 6 months of testimony, the case went to the 2 juries. The nation watched, captivated. And then came the stunning result. In January of 1994, both juries announced that they were hopelessly deadlocked. The jurors were split, torn between the 2 competing narratives of greed and abuse. The result was a mistrial for both brothers. For a moment, it seemed as though they might get away with it. But the prosecution, undeterred, announced their intention to try the case again. The second trial of Lyle and Eric Menendez, which began in August of 1995, was a very different affair. The cameras were gone, a new judge was presiding, and most significantly, there was only one jury. Judge Stanley M. Weisberg, who had a reputation as a no-nonsense jurist, made a series of rulings that severely limited the defense's ability to present their abuse narrative. He ruled that the jury could not consider the defense of imperfect self-defense, effectively gutting the central argument that had led to the first mistrial. Without the emotional power of the abuse defense, the prosecution's case, which had always been strong on the facts of the crime, became overwhelming. The focus returned to the brutality of the murders, the financial motive, and the brothers' own confession. The prosecution, now led by Deputy District Attorney David Kahn, relentlessly hammered home the idea that this was a simple, cold-blooded murder for money. After a trial that was far less sensational, but no less significant than the first, the jury retired to deliberate. This time, there was no deadlock. On March 20, 1996, the jury returned with its verdict, guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder for both Lyle and Eric Menendez. In the sentencing phase, the jury recommended life in prison without the possibility of parole, sparing them the death penalty. On July 2, 1996, the judge formally handed down the sentence. Lyle and Eric Menendez were sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences, a legal certainty that they would die in prison. The brothers were sent to separate prisons, their close, codependent bond finally severed by the state. For the next 2 decades, they languished in the California prison system, their case fading from the national spotlight, their appeals systematically denied. But the story of the Menendez brothers, and the questions it raised about abuse, trauma, and the nature of justice, never fully went away. In recent years, the case has seen a dramatic and unexpected resurgence in the public consciousness. A new generation, raised in the era of social media and a greater cultural understanding of the complexities of trauma and abuse, began to re-examine the case. In particular, embrace the brothers, seeing them not as cold-blooded killers, but as the tragic victims of a horrific upbringing, a view that was much closer to Leslie Abramson's original defense than to the prosecution's winning argument. This cultural shift, combined with new legal developments, created a perfect storm. In May of 2023, the brothers' appellate attorneys filed a habeas corpus petition, a legal maneuver to have their convictions vacated. They presented what they claimed was new evidence, including a letter written by Eric to a cousin in 1988, months before the murders, in which he seemed to allude to the ongoing abuse from his father. "It's still happening," he wrote. "Every night I stay up thinking he might come in." The petition landed on the desk of the then Los Angeles County District Attorney, George Gaskin, a progressive prosecutor who had made it his mission to re-examine old, potentially unjust sentences. In October of 2024, in a stunning move, Gaskin's office recommended that the brothers be resentenced. The resentencing hearing, however, was delayed, and by the time it was held, a new, more conservative district attorney, Nathan Hochman, was in office. Hochman vehemently opposed the resentencing, calling the brothers' claims of abuse lies. But the legal momentum was undeniable. On May 13, 2025, Los Angeles Superior Court Judge Michael Jezik, after a heartfelt hearing that included testimony from family members, made a landmark ruling. He resentenced Lyle and Eric Menendez to a term of 50 years to life, a sentence that made them immediately eligible for parole. After nearly 3 decades behind bars, the Menendez brothers, for the first time, had a chance at freedom. The final chapter of this long and tragic story is still being written. In August of 2025, Eric's first request for parole was denied, the parole board citing his unreasonable risk to public safety due to past rule violations in prison. Lyle's parole hearing is still pending. The brothers, who were reunited in the same correctional facility in 2018, continue to wait. The case of Lyle and Eric Menendez remains one of the most complex, divisive, and enduring crime stories in American history. It is a story that refuses to be simple, a story that is, at its heart, about two competing and irreconcilable truths. Were they two spoiled, greedy young men who killed their parents for an inheritance? Or were they two broken, terrified boys who killed their monstrous abusers in a desperate act of survival? The law has delivered its verdict, but the court of public opinion remains hopelessly deadlocked. The Menendez brothers' case is more than just a crime story. It is a dark American epic, a tragedy that continues to hold a mirror up to our ever-evolving understanding of justice, trauma, and the terrible, hidden secrets that can lie beneath the most perfect of surfaces. Story 11. In the late spring of 2005, the ancient market town of Richmond, in North Yorkshire, England, was a picture of pastoral tranquility. Nestled on the edge of the Yorkshire Dales, it is a town of cobblestone streets, a Norman castle that looms over the River Swale, and a quiet, settled way of life that feels a world away from the frantic energy of the modern world. Here, in a modest family home, lived 19-year-old Jenny Nicol. To her family and friends, Jenny was a girl on the cusp of her own life, a young woman with a quiet passion for music, a talent for playing the guitar in local pubs, and a job at the town supermarket that grounded her creative pursuits in the steady rhythm of everyday life. Jenny was the daughter of Anne and Brian Nicol, her father a man who had served in the British Army, the family having settled in Richmond when her older brother also joined the military and was posted to the nearby Catterick garrison. She was, by all accounts, a typical teenager, navigating the complex currents of friendship, family, and the first, tentative explorations of adulthood. But beneath the surface of this ordinary provincial life, a dark and secret relationship had taken root, a relationship that had begun years before in the shadows and was about to culminate in an act of violence so final and a deception so cruel that it would tear a family apart and haunt a community for years to come. On the evening of Thursday, June 30th, 2005, the Nicol home was filled with the quiet, familiar energy of a family preparing for a weekend. Jenny told her parents, and Brian, that she was planning to spend the night with friends, a not uncommon occurrence for a girl her age. She gathered a few belongings, items that suggested a camping trip, a small bag, a change of clothes, her mobile phone. At 6 p.m., she walked out the front door of her family home, a casual goodbye echoing behind her. It was the last time her parents would ever see her. The first few days of her absence were not, on their face, a cause for major alarm. Jenny was a young woman with her own life, her own circle of friends. It was conceivable that she had extended her camping trip, that she was caught up in the easy, untethered freedom of a summer weekend. But as the days stretched on with no word, no call, no text message, a cold tendril of unease began to wrap itself around her mother's heart. This wasn't like Jenny. She was close with her family. She would have checked in. By Monday, July 4th, the unease had blossomed into a full-blown, terrifying panic. And Brian Nicol went to the North Yorkshire police and reported their daughter missing. Their fear was amplified when they discovered her car, a white Rover 214i, parked and abandoned in the car park of the Holly Hill pub in Richmond. It was a stark, silent piece of evidence that something was terribly wrong. A girl on a camping trip does not abandon her car. A girl who has simply run away does not leave behind her means of escape. The police investigation began, as it so often does, with the painstaking work of trying to reconstruct the missing person's last known movements. They spoke to Jenny's friends, her co-workers, anyone and everyone who might have seen her, who might know where she was. And as they delved into her world, a name emerged from the shadows, a name that was, at first, a whisper of rumor and suspicion, but would soon become the dark, gravitational center of the entire investigation: David Hodgson. At 45, David Hodgson was a married father of two, a man who, on the surface, was a respectable member of the community. His daughters had attended the same school as Jenny. But he was also a man with a secret that he had been keeping for 5 years. He had been having an affair with Jenny Nicol, a relationship that had begun when she was just 14 years old. He had been grooming her, a slow, patient, and predatory campaign that had culminated in a sexual relationship when she turned 16. To the investigators, he was an immediate person of interest. 9 days after Jenny was reported missing, the police brought Hodgson in for questioning. He was a picture of cool denial. He denied having an affair with Jenny. He denied any knowledge of her whereabouts. He denied having anything to do with her disappearance. He was, in the eyes of the law, just another person in a long line of people to be interviewed. He was released without charge. Then, the next day, a miracle. Or so it seemed. Jenny's mobile phone, which had been silent for more than a week, was suddenly switched on. A series of text messages were sent, messages that seemed to confirm the police's initial, hopeful theory that she had simply run away. The messages, sent to her family and friends, spoke of a new life, a new beginning. They were a digital trail of breadcrumbs that led away from the dark woods of a potential homicide and into the sunlit uplands of a teenage drama. The messages were sent from locations far from Richmond, from Carlisle in Cumbria, from Jedburgh in the Scottish borders. For Nicole, the messages were a lifeline. She clung to the hope that her daughter was alive and well, that she had simply needed to get away. She traveled to both Carlisle and Jedburgh, a mother on a desperate pilgrimage, searching for a ghost in the streets of strange towns, her heart a frantic, hopeful drum in her chest. But for the investigators, the messages were a source of growing suspicion. They were too convenient, too neat. They felt wrong. As the summer wore on, and the initial hope of the text messages faded into a renewed and deepening silence, the police began to look at the case with a new, more cynical eye. In November of 2005, they made a public declaration that would shatter the last vestiges of the family's hope. The investigation, they announced, was no longer a missing person inquiry. It was a murder investigation. The search for Jenny Nicole was over. The hunt for her killer had just begun. As the investigation shifted from a search for a missing person to a hunt for a killer, the focus returned, with a new and more intense scrutiny, to David Hodgson. The man who had denied everything, the man whose life was a carefully constructed facade of respectability, was about to have that facade stripped away, revealing the dark, obsessive, and violent reality that lay beneath. At the end of July 2005, just a few weeks after Jenny's disappearance, police found David Hodgson in a remote, ramshackle hut near the village of Hudswell. He had taken an overdose of pills and wine, a desperate, theatrical suicide attempt that was, in the eyes of the investigators, a clear admission of a guilty conscience. He was saved, but the incident only served to deepen the suspicion that was gathering around him. In subsequent police interviews, his story began to change. He now admitted that he and Jenny had been lovers, but he claimed, in a desperate attempt to minimize his involvement, that the affair had ended a year prior. It was a lie, one of many that would eventually be his undoing. The investigators began to dig deeper into the complex, toxic relationships that had defined Jenny's last few weeks. They discovered another layer of betrayal, another secret that added a powerful, explosive motive to the case. In the weeks leading up to her disappearance, Jenny had begun a new relationship. The man she was seeing was Robert Hodgson, David Hodgson's older brother. Robert, it seemed, was unaware of his brother's long-running affair with Jenny. It was a love triangle of the most twisted and dangerous kind, a situation that the prosecution would later argue had pushed David Hodgson, a man they described as intensely jealous, over the edge. The police search, which had expanded to include over 150 areas, septic tanks, and even soldiers from the nearby Catterick garrison, now focused on a specific location, a remote, wooded area known as Sandbeck Plantation. It was here, in a series of crude, hidden huts that the Hodgson brothers had built together, that the investigators found the first, heartbreaking physical evidence of Jenny's last days. They found her nightdress, her beloved teddy bear, and her cassette player. And most crucially, they found DNA evidence that directly contradicted David Hodgson's claim that he had not been to the huts with Jenny. But even with this mounting pile of circumstantial evidence, the case was far from a slam dunk. There was still no body, no crime scene, no definitive proof that Jenny was dead, let alone that David Hodgson had killed her. The text messages, though suspicious, were still a powerful piece of counter-narrative, a digital ghost that seemed to insist she was alive. It was at this point that the investigation took a revolutionary and ultimately decisive turn. The police brought in an expert in a new and burgeoning field of forensic science, forensic linguistics. The text messages were subjected to a new kind of analysis, one that looked not at the content of the messages, but at their style, their grammar, their syntax, their very linguistic DNA. The expert compared the style of the text messages sent after Jenny's disappearance to a collection of her previous writings. The conclusion was stark and unequivocal. The person who had sent the messages from Carlisle and Jedburgh was not Jenny Nichol. The linguistic fingerprint did not match. The prosecution now had a powerful new weapon in their arsenal. They argued that the messages were a deliberate and cynical deception, sent by someone who knew Jenny was dead and who was trying to create a false trail. And they had a theory as to how that deception had been carried out. They presented evidence that David Hodgson had hired a car on July 9th and July 14th, 2005. The mileage on the car on those days corresponded almost exactly to the round-trip distances from Richmond to Carlisle and from Richmond to Jedburgh. And the dates of the car hires corresponded exactly to the dates the messages were sent. The lie had been meticulously planned, a road trip of deception with a dead girl's mobile phone as the only passenger. The case was now a complex, intricate puzzle, a no-body murder, that would have to be proven through a web of circumstantial evidence. But the web was strong, and it was tightening around one man. In May of 2007, nearly 2 years after Jenny had vanished, the police made their move. David Hodgson was formally charged with the murder of Jenny Nichol. He was remanded in custody, his long, secret war against the truth about to be brought into the harsh, unforgiving light of a courtroom. The trial of David Hodgson, which began at Teesside Crown Court in January of 2008, was a masterclass in the power of circumstantial evidence. With no body, no murder weapon, and no confession, the prosecution, led by prosecutor James Goss QC, had to build their case brick by brick, lie by lie, creating a structure of guilt so solid that it would be beyond any reasonable doubt. They told the jury the story of a secret, obsessive love affair, of a man who had groomed a teenage girl, a man who had become consumed by a murderous jealousy when that girl had turned her affections to his own brother. They argued that on the night of June 30th, 2005, David Hodgson had killed Jenny Nichol and had then disposed of her body with the cold, calculated intention that it should never be found. They presented the DNA evidence from the hut in Sandbeck Plantation, the physical proof that Hodgson had lied about being there with Jenny. They presented the evidence of the hired car, the mileage logs that were a silent, mathematical testament to his journey of deception. And they presented the powerful, groundbreaking evidence of the forensic linguist, who testified with scientific certainty that the text messages that had given Jenny's family so much false hope had not been written by her. The defense, faced with this mountain of evidence, did their best to create doubt. They brought David Hodgson's elder daughter to the stand, who testified that she had seen Jenny alive in Richmond 2 days after she had disappeared, and that Jenny had been staying with Robert Hodgson. It was a desperate, last-ditch attempt to shift suspicion, to suggest that the real killer was the brother, the new boyfriend. But Robert Hodgson, taking the stand, vehemently denied the claim, stating that he had not seen Jenny for some time. The defense also tried to attack the character of Jenny's own family. They attempted to portray her father, Brian, as abusive, suggesting that Jenny had run away from home to escape him. It was a cruel and baseless allegation, one that the judge would later say was made, without the slightest shred of supporting evidence. For Ann and Brian Nichol, who had to sit in court and endure this character assassination of their family, the trial was a new and terrible form of torture. David Hodgson himself maintained his innocence, his face a mask of defiant denial. But his lies had been exposed, his deceptions laid bare. He had told the police, in a moment of arrogant confidence, "You can't prove anything without a body." He was about to be proven devastatingly wrong. In February of 2008, after a trial that had lasted for weeks, the jury returned with its verdict. David Hodgson was found guilty of the murder of Jenny Nicol. He was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 18 years. The conviction was a landmark moment for the British legal system, a powerful affirmation that a murderer could be brought to justice even without the primary piece of evidence. The case of Jenny Nicol. In September of 2008, the Council for the Registration of Forensic Practitioners formally recognized forensic linguistics as a specialty, a direct result of the crucial role it had played in securing the conviction of David Hodgson. But for the Nicol family, the legal victory was a hollow one. They had justice, but they did not have their daughter. They did not have a grave to visit, a place to lay flowers, a final, tangible connection to the life that had been so brutally stolen from them. In November of 2009, a coroner formally ruled that Jenny Nicol was dead, her death an unlawful killing, a final, legal closing of a chapter that, for her family, will never truly be closed. The story of Jenny Nicol is a tragic and infuriating story of a young life extinguished by a secret, obsessive, and ultimately murderous love. It is a story of a killer's cruel and calculated deception, a campaign of lies that compounded a family's grief with a terrible and prolonged false hope. But it is also a story of a quiet revolution in the world of forensic science, a story of how the subtle, almost invisible, patterns of language can speak a truth louder than any denial. David Hodgson, the man who believed he had committed the perfect no-body murder, was brought down not by a single dramatic piece of evidence, but by the weight of his own lies, and by the unique, inimitable voice of the girl he had silenced, a voice that, through the power of science, was able to speak from beyond the grave and name her killer. The search for Jenny Nicol's body continues, a final, unanswered question in a story that is a heartbreaking testament to the enduring pain of loss and the relentless, unwavering pursuit of the truth. To her upscale apartment building. Her mind was likely on last-minute packing and the feel of sand between her toes. She navigated the familiar turns, ascending to her designated spot. The air in the garage was still and heavy, scented with concrete and exhaust fumes. It was a liminal space, a pause between the bustling world outside and the sanctuary of home. She pulled into her spot, the engine died, and in that sudden silence, her future, so vividly imagined only moments before, was extinguished. A dark figure emerged from the shadows. A flash, a deafening roar, and a single fatal gunshot. Kendra Hatcher, a woman of deep faith and boundless kindness, was dead before her head hit the steering wheel. The initial report would suggest a robbery gone horrifically wrong, a tragic but not altogether unfamiliar story in a large city. But the truth was infinitely more sinister, born not of random violence, but of a calculated and venomous obsession. The architect of this darkness was a woman Kendra had never met, Brenda Berenice Delgado Reinaga. Brenda's story, like Kendra's, was one of ambition. Born in Mexico on June 18, 1982, she was brought to Dallas as an infant by her father, Luis, who sought a better life for his wife and 5 children. Brenda, the only daughter, grew up with the pressure and promise of the American dream. She was described as driven, always wanting to make something of herself. After graduating from high school, she became a dental assistant, later taking on a second job whitening teeth at a day spa to supplement her income. She was, by many accounts, working tirelessly to achieve her goals. Her life took a decisive turn when she met Ricky Paniagua on a dating app. He was a resident at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center, a handsome, successful doctor on a promising career path. For nearly 3 years, they were a couple. In Brenda's mind, this was the life she had been working toward. But the relationship was not as stable as she portrayed it. They broke up in the summer of 2014, only to reconcile briefly from November 2014 until February 2015. When Ricky ended it for good. For Ricky, the breakup was a definitive end, but for Brenda, it was merely